college trip, but Mom and Dad couldn't afford it. His pen friend got all offended when he said he wasn't going and sent him a cursed hat. It made his ears shrivel up. Harry laughed, but didn't voice the amazement he felt at hearing about other wizarding schools. He supposed, now that he saw representatives of so many nationalities in the campsite, that he had been stupid never to realize that Hogwarts couldn't be the only one. He glanced at Hermione, who looked utterly unsurprised by the information. No doubt she had run across the news about other wizarding schools in some book or other. "You've been ages," said George when they finally got back to the Weasleys' tents. "Met a few people," said Ron, setting the water down. "You not got that fire started yet?" "Dad's having fun with the matches," said Fred. Mr. Weasley was having no success at all in lighting the fire, but it wasn't for lack of trying. Splintered matches littered the ground around him, but he looked as though he was having the time of his life. "Oops," he said as he managed to light a match and promptly dropped it in surprise. "Come here, Mr. Weasley," said Hermione kindly, taking the box from him and showing him how to do it properly. At last they got the fire lit, though it was at least another hour before it was hot enough to cook anything. There was plenty to watch while they waited, however. Their tent seemed to be pitched right alongside a kind of thoroughfare to the field, and Ministry members kept hurrying up and down it, greeting Mr. Weasley cordially as they passed. Mr. Weasley kept up a running commentary, mainly for Harry's and Hermione's benefit. His own children knew too much about the Ministry to be greatly interested. That was Cuthbert Mockridge, head of the Goblin Liaison Office. Here comes Gilbert Wimple. He's with the Committee on Experimental Charms. He's had those horns for a while now. Oh, Artie. Arnold Peasgood. He's an Obliviator, member of the Accidental Magic Reversal Squad, you know. And that's Bowden Croker. They're unspeakables. They're what? From the Department of Mysteries, top secret. No idea what they get up to. At last, the fire was ready, and they had just started cooking eggs and sausages when Bill, Charlie, and Percy came strolling out of the woods toward them. "Just apparated, Dad," said Percy loudly. "Ah, excellent. Lunch." They were halfway through their plates of eggs and sausages when Mr. Weasley jumped to his feet, waving and grinning at a man who was striding toward them. "Aha!" he said. "The man of the moment, Ludo." Ludo Bagman was easily the most noticeable person Harry had seen so far, even including old Archie in his flowered nightdress. He was wearing long Quidditch robes in thick horizontal stripes of bright yellow and black. An enormous picture of a wasp was splashed across his chest. He had the look of a powerfully built man gone slightly to seed. The robes were stretched tightly across a large belly he surely had not had in the days when he had played Quidditch for England. His nose was squashed, probably broken by a stray bludger, Harry thought, but his round blue eyes, short blonde hair, and rosy complexion made him look like a very overgrown schoolboy. "Ahoy there!" Bagman called happily. He was walking as though he had springs attached to the balls of his feet, and was plainly in a state of wild excitement. "Arthur, old man," he puffed as he reached the campfire. "What a day, eh? What a day! Could we have asked for more perfect weather? A cloudless night coming, and hardly a hiccup in the arrangements. Not much for me to do." Behind him, a group of haggard-looking Ministry wizards rushed past, pointing at the distant evidence of some sort of a magical fire that was sending violet sparks 20 feet into the air. Percy hurried forward with his hand outstretched. Apparently, his disapproval of the way Ludo Bagman ran his department did not prevent him from wanting to make a good impression. "Ah, yes," said Mr. Weasley, grinning. "This is my son Percy. He's just started at the Ministry. And this is Fred. No, George, sorry. That's Fred. Bill, Charlie, Ron, my daughter Ginny, and Ron's friends Hermione Granger and Harry Potter." Bagman did the smallest of double takes when he heard Harry's name, and his eyes performed the familiar flick upward to the scar on Harry's forehead. "Everyone," Mr. Weasley continued, "this is Ludo Bagman. You know who he is. It's thanks to him we've got such good tickets." Bagman beamed and waved his hand as if to say it had been nothing. "Fancy a flutter on the match, Arthur?" he said eagerly, jingling what seemed to be a large amount of gold in the pockets of his yellow and black robes. "I've already got Rodney Pontner betting me Bulgaria will score first. I offered him nice odds, considering Ireland's front three are the strongest I've seen in years, and little Agatha Timms has put up half shares in her eel farm on a week-long match." "Oh, go on then," said Mr. Weasley. "Let's see. A galleon on Ireland to win?" "A galleon?" Ludo Bagman looked slightly disappointed, but recovered himself. Very well, very well. Any other takers?" "They're a bit young to be gambling," said Mr. Weasley. "Molly wouldn't like. We'll bet 37 galleons, 15 sickles, 3 canutes," said Fred, as he and George quickly pooled all their money. "That Ireland wins, but Victor Crumb gets the snitch. Oh, and we'll throw in a fake wand." "You don't want to go showing Mr. Bagman rubbish like that," Percy hissed, but Bagman didn't seem to think the wand was rubbish at all. On the contrary, his boyish face shone with excitement as he took it from Fred, and when the wand gave a loud squawk and turned into a rubber chicken, Bagman roared with laughter. "Excellent! I haven't seen one that convincing in years. I'd pay 5 galleons for that." Percy froze in an attitude of stunned disapproval. "Boys," said Mr. Weasley under his breath, "I don't want you betting. That's all your savings. Your mother—" "Don't be a spoil sport, Arthur," boomed Ludo Bagman, rattling his pockets excitedly. "They're old enough to know what they want. You reckon Ireland will win, but Crum'll get the snitch? Not a chance, boys, not a chance. I'll give you excellent odds on that one. We'll add 5 galleons for the funny wand then, shall we?" Mr. Weasley looked on helplessly as Ludo Bagman whipped out a notebook and quill and began jotting down the twins' names. "Cheers," said George, taking the slip of parchment Bagman handed him and tucking it away into the front of his robes. Bagman turned most cheerfully back to Mr. Weasley. "Couldn't do me a brew, I suppose. I'm keeping an eye out for Barty Crouch. My Bulgarian opposite number's making difficulties, and I can't understand a word he's saying. Barty'll be able to sort it out. He speaks about 150 languages." "Mr. Crouch?" said Percy, suddenly abandoning his look of poker-stiff disapproval and positively writhing with excitement. "He speaks over 200. Mermish and gobbledygook and troll." "Anyone can speak troll," said Fred dismissively. "All you have to do is point and grunt." Percy threw Fred an extremely nasty look and stoked the fire vigorously to bring the kettle back to the boil. "Any news of Bertha Jorkins yet, Ludo?" Mr. Weasley asked as Bagman settled himself down on the grass beside them all. "Not a dicky bird," said Bagman comfortably. "But she'll turn up. Poor old Bertha. Memory like a leaky cauldron and no sense of direction. Lost, you take my word for it. She'll wander back into the office sometime in October, thinking it's still July." "You don't think it might be time to send someone to look for her?" Mr. Weasley suggested tentatively as Percy handed Bagman his tea. "Barty Crouch keeps saying that," said Bagman, his round eyes widening innocently. "But we really can't spare anyone at the moment." "Oh, talk of the devil, Barty!" A wizard had just apparated at their fireside, and he could not have made more of a contrast with Ludo Bagman, sprawled on the grass in his old wasp robes. Barty Crouch was a stiff, upright, elderly man, dressed in an impeccably crisp suit and tie. The parting in his short gray hair was almost unnaturally straight, and his narrow toothbrush mustache looked as though he trimmed it using a slide rule. His shoes were very highly polished. Harry could see at once why Percy idolized him. Percy was a great believer in rigidly following rules, and Mr. Crouch had complied with the rule about muggle dressing so thoroughly that he could have passed for a bank manager. Harry doubted even Uncle Vernon would have spotted him for what he really was. "Pull up a bit of grass, Barty," said Ludo brightly, patting the ground beside him. "No, thank you, Ludo," said Crouch, and there was a bite of impatience in his voice. I've been looking for you everywhere. The Bulgarians are insisting we add another 12 seats to the top box." "Oh, is that what they're after?" said Bagman. "I thought the chap was asking to borrow a pair of tweezers. Bit of a strong accent." "Mr. Crouch," said Percy breathlessly, sunk into a kind of half-bow that made him look like a hunchback. "Would you like a cup of tea?" "Oh," said Mr. Crouch, looking over at Percy in mild surprise. "Yes. Thank you, Weatherby." Fred and George choked into their own cups. Percy, very pink around the ears, busied himself with the kettle. "Oh, and I've been wanting a word with you too, Arthur," said Mr. Crouch, his sharp eyes falling upon Mr. Weasley. "Ali Bashir's on the warpath. He wants a word with you about your embargo on flying carpets." Mr. Weasley heaved a deep sigh. "I sent him an owl about that just last week. If I've told him once, I've told him 100 times. Carpets are defined as a Muggle artifact by the Registry of Prescribed Charmable Objects. But will he listen?" "I doubt it," said Mr. Crouch, accepting a cup from Percy. "He's desperate to export here." "Well, they'll never replace brooms in Britain, will they?" said Bagman. "Ali thinks there's a niche in the market for a family vehicle," said Mr. Crouch. "I remember my grandfather had an Axminster that could seat 12, but that was before carpets were banned, of course." He spoke as though he wanted to leave nobody in any doubt that all his ancestors had abided strictly by the law. "So, been keeping busy, Bertie?" said Bagman breezily. "Fairly," said Mr. Crouch dryly. "Organizing portkeys across 5 continents is no mean feat, Ludo." "I expect you'll both be glad when this is over," said Mr. Weasley. Ludo Bagman looked shocked. "Glad? Don't know when I've had more fun. Still, it's not as though we haven't got anything to look forward to, Bertie? Plenty left to organize, Mr. Crouch raised his eyebrows at Bagman. "We agreed not to make the announcement until all the details—" "All details," said Bagman, waving the word away like a cloud of midges. "They've signed, haven't they? They've agreed, haven't they? I bet you anything these kids will know soon enough anyway. I mean, it's happening at Hogwarts, Ludo. We need to meet the Bulgarians, you know," said Mr. Crouch sharply, cutting Bagman's remarks short. "Thank you for the tea, Weatherby." He pushed his undrunk tea back at Percy and waited for Ludo to rise. Bagman struggled to his feet, swigging down the last of his tea, the gold in his pockets chinking merrily. "See you all later," he said. "You'll be up in the top box with me. I'm commentating." He waved. Bertie Crouch nodded curtly, and both of them disapparated. "What's happening in Hogwarts, Dad?" said Fred at once. "What were they talking about?" "You'll find out soon enough," said Mr. Weasley, smiling. "It's classified information until such time as the Ministry decides to release it," said Percy stiffly. Mr. Crouch was quite right not to disclose it. "Oh, shut up, Weatherby," said Fred. A sense of excitement rose like a palpable cloud over the campsite as the afternoon wore on. By dusk, the still summer air itself seemed to be quivering with anticipation, and as darkness spread like a curtain over the thousands of waiting wizards, the last vestiges of pretense disappeared. The Ministry seemed to have bowed to the inevitable and stopped fighting the signs of blatant magic now breaking out everywhere. Salesmen were apparating every few feet, carrying trays and pushing carts full of extraordinary merchandise. There were luminous rosettes, green for Ireland, red for Bulgaria, which were squealing the names of the players. Pointed green hats bedecked with dancing shamrocks, Bulgarian scarves adorned with lions that really roared, flags from both countries that played their national anthems as they were waved. There were tiny models of firebolts that really flew, and collectible figures of famous players, which strolled across the palm of your hand, preening themselves. "Been saving my pocket money all summer for this," Ron told Harry as they and Hermione strolled through the salesmen, buying souvenirs. Though Ron purchased a dancing shamrock hat and a large green rosette, He also bought a small figure of Victor Crumb, the Bulgarian seeker. The miniature Crumb walked backward and forward over Ron's hand, scowling up at the green rosette above him. "Wow, look at these," said Harry, hurrying over to a cart piled high with what looked like brass binoculars, except that they were covered with all sorts of weird knobs and dials. "Omnioculars," said the sales wizard eagerly. "You can replay action, slow everything down, and they flash up a play-by-play breakdown if you need it. Bargain, 10 galleons each." "Wish I hadn't bought this now," said Ron, gesturing at his dancing shamrock hat and gazing longingly at the omnioculars. "3 pairs," said Harry firmly to the wizard. "No, don't bother," said Ron, going red. He was always touchy about the fact that Harry, who had inherited a small fortune from his parents, had much more money than he did. "You won't be getting anything for Christmas," Harry told him, thrusting omnioculars into his and Hermione's hands. "For about 10 years, mind." "Fair enough," said Ron, grinning. "Oh, thanks, Harry," said Hermione, "and I'll get us some programs. Look." Their money bags considerably lighter, they went back to the tents. Bill, Charlie, and Ginny were all sporting green rosettes too, and Mr. Weasley was carrying an Irish flag. Fred and George had no souvenirs, as they had given Bagman all their gold. And then a deep, booming gong sounded somewhere beyond the woods, and at once green and red lanterns blazed into life in the trees, lighting a path to the field. "It's time," said Mr. Weasley, looking as excited as any of them. "Come on, let's go!" Chapter 8. The Quidditch World Cup. Clutching their purchases, Mr. Weasley in the lead, they all hurried into the wood, following the lantern-lit trail. They could hear the sounds of thousands of people moving around them, shouts and laughter, snatches of singing. The atmosphere of feverish excitement was highly infectious. Harry couldn't stop grinning. They walked through the wood for 20 minutes, talking and joking loudly, until at last they emerged on the other side and found themselves in the shadow of a gigantic stadium. Though Harry could see only a fraction of the immense gold walls surrounding the field, he could tell that 10 cathedrals would fit comfortably inside it. "Seats 100,000, said Mr. Weasley, spotting the awestruck look on Harry's face. "Ministry task force of 500 have been working on it all year. Muggle-repelling charms on every inch of it. Every time Muggles have got anywhere near here all year, they've suddenly remembered urgent appointments and had to dash away again. Bless them," he added fondly, leading the way toward the nearest entrance, which was already surrounded by a swarm of shouting witches and wizards. "Prime seats," said the Ministry witch at the entrance when she checked their tickets. "Top bucks, straight upstairs, Arthur, and as high as you can go." The stairs into the stadium were carpeted in rich purple. They clambered upward with the rest of the crowd, which slowly filtered away through doors into the stands to their left and right. Mr. Weasley's party kept climbing, and at last they reached the top of the staircase and found themselves in a small box, set at the highest point of the stadium and situated exactly halfway between the golden goalposts. About 20 purple and gilt chairs stood in 2 rows here, and Harry, filing into the front seats with the Weasleys, looked down upon a scene the likes of which he could never have imagined. 100,000 witches and wizards were taking their places in the seats, which rose in levels around the long oval field. Everything was suffused with a mysterious golden light, which seemed to come from the stadium itself. The field looked smooth as velvet from their lofty position. At either end of the field stood 3 goal hoops, 50 feet high. Right opposite them, almost at Harry's eye level, was a gigantic blackboard. Gold writing kept dashing across it, as though an invisible giant's hand were scrawling upon the blackboard and then wiping it off again. Watching it, Harry saw that it was flashing advertisements across the field. The Blue Bottle, a broom for all the family. Safe, reliable, and with built-in anti-burglar buzzer. Mrs. Scour's all-purpose magical mess remover. No pain, no stain. Glad Rags Wizardwear. London, Paris, Hogsmeade. Harry tore his eyes away from the sign and looked over his shoulder to see who else was sharing the box with him. So far it was empty, except for a tiny creature sitting in the second-from-last seat at the end of the row behind them. The creature, whose legs were so short they stuck out in front of it on the chair, was wearing a tea towel draped like a toga, and it had its face hidden in its hands. Yet those long, bat-like ears were oddly familiar. "Dobby?" said Harry incredulously. The tiny creature looked up and stretched its fingers, revealing enormous brown eyes and a nose the exact size and shape of a large tomato. It wasn't Dobby. It was, however, unmistakably a house elf, as Harry's friend Dobby had been. Harry had set Dobby free from his old owners, the Malfoy family. "Did Sir just call me Dobby?" squeaked the elf curiously from between its fingers. Its voice was higher even than Dobby's had been, a teeny, quivering squeak of a voice, and Harry suspected, though it was very hard to tell with a house elf, that this one might just be female. Ron and Hermione spun around in their seats to look. Though they had heard a lot about Dobby from Harry, they had never actually met him. Even Mr. Weasley looked around in interest. "Sorry," Harry told the elf. "I just thought you were someone I knew." "But I knows Dobby too, sir," squeaked the elf. She was shielding her face as though blinded by light, though the top box was not brightly lit. "My name is Winky, sir. And yours, sir?" Her dark brown eyes widened to the size of side plates as they rested upon Harry's scar. "You is surely Harry Potter." "Yeah, I am," said Harry. "But Dobby talks of you all the time, sir," she said, lowering her hands very slightly and looking awestruck. "How is he?" said Harry. "How's freedom suiting him?" "Ah, sir," said Winky, shaking her head. "Ah, sir, meaning no disrespect, sir, but I is not sure you did Dobby a favor, sir, when you was setting him free." "Why?" said Harry, taken aback. "What's wrong with him?" "Freedom is going to Dobby's head, sir," said Winky sadly. "Ideas above his station, sir. Can't get another position, sir." "Why not?" said Harry. Winky lowered her voice by a half octave and whispered, "He is wanting paying for his work, sir." "Paying?" said Harry blankly. "Well, why shouldn't he be paid?" Winky looked quite horrified at the idea and closed her fingers slightly so that her face was half hidden again. "House elves is not paid, sir," she said in a muffled squeak. "No, no, no. I says to Dobby, I says, go find yourself a nice family and settle down, Dobby. He is getting up to all sorts of hijinks, sir, what is unbecoming to a house elf. You goes reckoning around like this, Dobby, I says, and next thing I hear, you's up in front of the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures, like some common goblin." "Well, it's about time he had a bit of fun," said Harry. "House elves is not supposed to have fun, Harry Potter," said Winky firmly from behind her hands. "House elves does what they is told. I is not liking heights at all, Harry Potter." She glanced toward the edge of the box and gulped. "But my master sends me to the top box, and I comes, sir." "Why's he sent you up here if he knows you don't like heights?" said Harry, frowning. Master wants me to seat in a seat, Harry Potter. He is very busy," said Winky, tilting her head toward the empty space beside her. "Winky is wishing she is back in Master's tent, Harry Potter, but Winky does what she is told. Winky is a good house elf." She gave the edge of the box another frightened look and hid her eyes completely again. Harry turned back to the others. So that's a house elf? Ron muttered. Weird things, aren't they? Dobby was weirder, said Harry fervently. Ron pulled out his omnioculars and started testing them, staring down into the crowd on the other side of the stadium. Wild, he said, twiddling the replay knob on the side. I can make that old bloke down there pick his nose again, and again, and again. Hermione, meanwhile, was skimming eagerly through her velvet-covered, tasseled program. A display from the team mascots will precede the match, she read aloud. Well, that's always worth watching, said Mr. Weasley. National teams bring creatures from their native land, you know, to put on a bit of a show. The box filled gradually around them over the next half hour. Mr. Weasley kept shaking hands with people who were obviously very important wizards. Percy jumped to his feet so often that he looked as though he were trying to sit on a hedgehog. When Cornelius Fudge, the Minister of Magic himself, arrived, Percy bowed so low that his glasses fell off and shattered. Highly embarrassed, he repaired them with his wand, and thereafter remained in his seat, throwing jealous looks at Harry, whom Cornelius Fudge had greeted like an old friend. They had met before, and Fudge shook Harry's hand in a fatherly fashion, asked how he was, and introduced him to the wizards on either side of him. Harry Potter, you know, he told the Bulgarian minister loudly, who was wearing splendid robes of black velvet trimmed with gold, and didn't seem to understand a word of English. Harry Potter. Oh, come on now, you know who he is. The boy who survived you know who. You do know who he is. The Bulgarian wizard suddenly spotted Harry's scar and started gabbling loudly and excitedly, pointing at it. Knew we'd get there in the end, said Fudge wearily to Harry. I'm no great shakes at languages. I need Barty Crouch for this sort of thing. Ah, I see his house elves sitting in a seat. Good job, too. These Bulgarian blighters have been trying to cadge all the best places. Ah, and here's Lucius. Harry, Ron, and Hermione turned quickly, edging along the second row to 3 still empty seats right behind Mr. Weasley, were none other than Dobby the house elf's former owners, Lucius Malfoy, his son Draco, and a woman Harry supposed must be Draco's mother. Harry and Draco Malfoy had been enemies ever since their very first journey to Hogwarts. A pale boy with a pointed face and white blonde hair, Draco greatly resembled his father. His mother was blonde too, tall and slim. She would have been nice-looking if she hadn't been wearing a look that suggested there was a nasty smell under her nose. "Ah, Fudge," said Mr. Malfoy, holding out his hand as he reached the Minister of Magic. "How are you? I don't think you've met my wife, Narcissa, or our son, Draco." "How do you do? How do you do?" said Fudge, smiling and bowing to Mrs. Malfoy. "And allow me to introduce you to Mr. Oblonsk. Oblonsk. Well, he's the Bulgarian Minister of Magic, and he can't understand a word I'm saying anyway, so never mind. And let's see who else. You know Arthur Weasley, I dare say?" It was a tense moment. Mr. Weasley and Mr. Malfoy looked at each other, and Harry vividly recalled the last time they had come face to face. It had been in Flourish and Blott's bookshop, and they had had a fight. Mr. Malfoy's cold gray eyes swept over Mr. Weasley, and then up and down the row. "Good Lord, Arthur," he said softly. "What did you have to sell to get seats in the top box? Surely your house wouldn't have fetched this much." Fudge, who wasn't listening, said, "Lucius has just given a very generous contribution to St. Mungo's Hospital for Magical Maladies and Injuries, Arthur. He's here as my guest." How nice," said Mr. Weasley, with a very strained smile. Mr. Malfoy's eyes had returned to Hermione, who went slightly pink, but stared determinedly back at him. Harry knew exactly what was making Mr. Malfoy's lip curl like that. The Malfoys prided themselves on being purebloods. In other words, they considered anyone of Muggle descent, like Hermione, second class. However, under the gaze of the Minister of Magic, Mr. Malfoy didn't dare say anything. He nodded sneeringly to Mr. Weasley and continued down the line to his seats. Draco shot Harry, Ron, and Hermione one contemptuous look, then settled himself between his mother and father. "Slimy gits," Ron muttered as he, Harry, and Hermione turned to face the field again. Next moment, Ludo Bagman charged into the box. "Everyone ready?" he said, his round face gleaming like a great excited Edom. "Minister, ready to go?" "Ready when you are, Ludo," said Fudge comfortably. Ludo whipped out his wand, directed it at his own throat, and said, "Sonorous," and then spoke over the roar of sound that was now filling the packed stadium. His voice echoed over them, booming into every corner of the stands. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the final of the 422nd Quidditch World Cup." The spectators screamed and clapped. Thousands of flags waved, adding their discordant national anthems to the racket. The huge blackboard opposite them was wiped clear of its last message. "Bertie Bott's every flavor beans, a risk with every mouthful," and now showed Bulgaria 0, Ireland 0. And now, without further ado, allow me to introduce the Bulgarian national team mascots. The right-hand side of the stands, which was a solid block of scarlet, roared its approval. "I wonder what they've brought," said Mr. Weasley, leaning forward in his seat. "Ah!" He suddenly whipped off his glasses and polished them hurriedly on his robes. "Vila!" "What are Vila?" But 100 Vila were now gliding out onto the field, and Harry's question was answered for him. Vila were women, the most beautiful women Harry had ever seen, except that they couldn't be, human. This puzzled Harry for a moment while he tried to guess what exactly they could be. What could make their skin shine moon bright like that, or their white gold hair fan out behind them without wind? But then the music started, and Harry stopped worrying about them not being human. In fact, he stopped worrying about anything at all. The Vila had started to dance, and Harry's mind had gone completely and blissfully blank. All that mattered in the world was that he kept watching the Vila, because if they stopped dancing, terrible things would happen. And as the Vila danced faster and faster, wild, half-formed thoughts started chasing through Harry's dazed mind. He wanted to do something very impressive right now. Jumping from the box into the stadium seemed a good idea. But would it be good enough? "Harry, what are you doing?" said Hermione's voice from a long way off. The music stopped. Harry blinked. He was standing up, and one of his legs was resting on the wall of the box. Next to him, Ron was frozen in an attitude that looked as though he were about to dive from a springboard. Angry yells were filling the stadium. The crowd didn't want the Vila to go. Harry was with them. He would, of course, be supporting Bulgaria, and he wondered vaguely why he had a large green shamrock pinned to his chest. Ron, meanwhile, was absent-mindedly shredding the shamrocks on his hat. Mr. Weasley, smiling slightly, leaned over to Ron and tugged the hat out of his hands. "You'll be wanting that," he said, "once Ireland have had their say." "Huh?" said Ron, staring open-mouthed at the Vila, who had now lined up along one side of the field. Hermione made a loud, tutting noise. She reached up and pulled Harry back into his seat. "Honestly," she said. "And now," roared Ludo Bagman's voice, "kindly put your wands in the air for the Irish national team mascots." Next moment, what seemed to be a great green and gold comet came zooming into the stadium. It did one circuit of the stadium, then split into two smaller comets, each hurtling toward the goalposts. A rainbow arced suddenly across the field, connecting the two balls of light. The crowd oohed and awed, as though at a fireworks display. Now the rainbow faded, and the balls of light reunited and merged. They had formed a great shimmering shamrock, which rose up into the sky and began to soar over the stands. Something like golden rain seemed to be falling from it. "Excellent!" yelled Ron, as the shamrock soared over them, and heavy gold coins rained from it, bouncing off their heads and seats. Squinting up at the shamrock, Harry realized that it was actually comprised of thousands of tiny little bearded men with red vests, each carrying a minute lamp of gold or green. "Leprechauns," said Mr. Weasley over the tumultuous applause of the crowd, many of whom were still fighting and rummaging around under their chairs to retrieve the gold. "There you go," Ron yelled happily, stuffing a fistful of gold coins into Harry's hand. "For the omnioculars. Now you've got to buy me a Christmas present. Ha!" The great shamrock dissolved. The leprechauns drifted down onto the field on the opposite side from the villa and settled themselves cross-legged to watch the match. "And now, ladies and gentlemen, kindly welcome the Bulgarian national Quidditch team. I give you Dimitrov." A scarlet-clad figure on a broomstick, moving so fast it was blurred, shot out onto the field from an entrance far below, to wild applause from the Bulgarian supporters. "Ivanova!" A second scarlet-robed player zoomed out. "Zograf, Levski, Volchanov, Volkov, and Krum." "That's him! That's him!" yelled Ron, following Krum with his omnioculars. Harry quickly focused his own. Victor Krum was thin, dark, and sallow-skinned, with a large, curved nose and thick black eyebrows. He looked like an overgrown bird of prey. It was hard to believe he was only 18. "And now, please greet the Irish national Quidditch team," yelled Bagman, "presenting Connolly, Ryan, Troy, Mullet, Moran, Quigley, and Lynch." 7 green blurs swept onto the field. Harry spun a small dial on the side of his omnioculars and slowed the players down enough to read the word Firebolt on each of their brooms and see their names embroidered in silver upon their backs. "And here, all the way from Egypt, our referee, acclaimed chair wizard of the International Association of Quidditch, Hassan Mustafa." A small and skinny wizard, completely bald but with a mustache to rival Uncle Vernon's, wearing robes of pure gold to match the stadium, strode out onto the field. A silver whistle was protruding from under the mustache, and he was carrying a large wooden crate under one arm, his broomstick under the other. Harry spun the speed dial on his omnioculars back to normal, watching closely as Mustafa mounted his broomstick and kicked the crate open. 4 balls burst into the air. The scarlet quaffle, the 2 black bludgers, and Harry saw it for the briefest moment before it sped out of sight, the minuscule winged golden snitch. With a sharp blast on his whistle, Mustafa shot into the air after the balls. "They're off!" screamed Bagman. "And it's Mullet, Troy, Moran, Dimitrov, back to Mullet, Troy, Levski, Moran." It was Quidditch as Harry had never seen it played before. He was pressing his omnioculars so hard to his glasses that they were cutting into the bridge of his nose. The speed of the players was incredible. The chasers were throwing the quaffle to one another so fast that Bagman only had time to say their names. Harry spun the slow dial on the right of his omnioculars again, pressed the play-by-play button on the top, and he was immediately watching in slow motion, while glittering purple lettering flashed across the lenses and the noise of the crowd pounded against his eardrums. "Hawk's Head attacking formation," he read as he watched the three Irish chasers zoom closely together, Troy in the center, slightly ahead of Mullet and Moran, bearing down upon the Bulgarians. "Porskov Troy" flashed up next, as Troy made as though to dart upward with the quaffle, drawing away the Bulgarian chaser Ivanova and dropping the quaffle to Moran. One of the Bulgarian beaters, Volkov, swung hard at a passing bludger with his small club, knocking it into Moran's path. Moran ducked to avoid the bludger and dropped the quaffle, and Levski, soaring beneath, caught it. "Troy scars!" roared Bagman, and the stadium shuddered with a roar of applause and cheers. 10-0 to Ireland. "What?" Harry yelled, looking wildly around through his omnioculars. "But Levski's got the quaffle." "Harry, if you're not going to watch at normal speed, you're going to miss things," shouted Hermione, who was dancing up and down, waving her arms in the air while Troy did a lap of honor around the field. Harry looked quickly over the top of his omnioculars and saw that the leprechauns watching from the sidelines had all risen into the air again and formed the great glittering shamrock. Across the field, the Vila were watching them sulkily. Furious with himself, Harry spun his speed dial back to normal as play resumed. Harry knew enough about Quidditch to see that the Irish chasers were superb. They worked as a seamless team, their movements so well coordinated that they appeared to be reading one another's minds as they positioned themselves, and the rosette on Harry's chest kept squeaking their names. Troy, Mullet, Moran. And within 10 minutes, Ireland had scored twice more, bringing their lead to 30-0, and causing a thunderous tide of roars and applause from the green-clad supporters. The match became still faster, but more brutal. Volkov and Volchanov, the Bulgarian beaters, were whacking the bludgers as fiercely as possible at the Irish chasers, and were starting to prevent them from using some of their best moves. Twice they were forced to scatter, and then, finally, Ivanova managed to break through their ranks, dodge the keeper Ryan, and score Bulgaria's first goal. "Fingers in your ears," bellowed Mr. Weasley as the Vila started to dance in celebration. Harry screwed up his eyes, too. He wanted to keep his mind on the game. After a few seconds, he chanced to glance at the field. The Vila had stopped dancing, and Bulgaria was again in possession of the quaffle. "Dimitrov, Levski, Dimitrov, Ivanova, oh, I say!" roared Bagman. 100,000 wizards gasped as the two seekers, Crumb and Lynch, plummeted through the center of the chasers, so fast that it looked as though they had just jumped from airplanes without parachutes. Harry followed their descent through his omnioculars, squinting to see where the snitch was. "They're going to crash!" screamed Hermione next to Harry. She was half right. At the very last second, Victor Crumb pulled out of the dive and spiraled off. Lynch, however, hit the ground with a dull thud that could be heard throughout the stadium. A huge groan rose from the Irish seats. "Full!" moaned Mr. Weasley. "Crumb was fainting." "It's time out," yelled Bagman's voice, as trained meta-wizards hurry onto the field to examine Aidan Lynch. "He'll be okay. He only got plowed," Charlie said reassuringly to Ginny, who was hanging over the side of the box looking horror-struck. Which is what Crumb was after, of course. Harry hastily pressed the replay and play-by-play buttons on his omnioculars, twiddled the speed dial, and put them back up to his eyes. He watched as Crumb and Lynch dived again in slow motion. Wronski defensive feint, dangerous seeker diversion, read the shining purple lettering across his lenses. He saw Crumb's face contorted with concentration as he pulled out of the dive just in time, while Lynch was flattened. And he understood. Crumb hadn't seen the snitch at all. He was just making Lynch copy him. Harry had never seen anyone fly like that. Crumb hardly looked as though he was using a broomstick at all. He moved so easily through the air that he looked unsupported and weightless. Harry turned his omnioculars back to normal and focused them on Crumb. He was now circling high above Lynch, who was being revived by meta-wizards with cups of potion. Harry, focusing still more closely upon Crumb's face, saw his dark eyes darting all over the ground 100 feet below. He was using the time while Lynch was revived to look for the snitch without interference. Lynch got to his feet at last, to loud cheers from the green-clad supporters, mounted his firebolt, and kicked back off into the air. His revival seemed to give Ireland new heart. When Mustafa blew his whistle again, the chasers moved into action with a skill unrivaled by anything Harry had seen so far. After 15 more fast and furious minutes, Ireland had pulled ahead by 10 more goals. They were now leading by 130 points to 10, and the game was starting to get dirtier. As Mullet shot toward the goalposts yet again, clutching the quaffle tightly under her arm, the Bulgarian keeper, Zograf, flew out to meet her. Whatever happened was over so quickly, Harry didn't catch it, but a scream of rage from the Irish crowd and Mustafa's long, shrill whistle blast told him it had been a foul. And Mustafa takes the Bulgarian keeper to task for cobbing, excessive use of elbows, Bagman informed the roaring spectators. And yes, it's a penalty to Ireland. The leprechauns, who had risen angrily into the air like a swarm of glittering hornets when Mullet had been fouled, now darted together to form the words, "Ha, ha, ha." The Vila on the other side of the field leapt to their feet, tossed their hair angrily, and started to dance again. As one, the Weasley boys and Harry stuffed their fingers into their ears, but Hermione, who hadn't bothered, was soon tugging on Harry's arm. He turned to look at her, and she pulled his fingers impatiently out of his ears. "Look at the referee," she said, giggling. Harry looked down at the field. Hassan Mustafa had landed right in front of the dancing Vila, and was acting very oddly indeed. He was flexing his muscles and smoothing his mustache excitedly. "Now we can't have that," said Ludo Bagman, though he sounded highly amused. "Somebody slapped the referee." A meta-wizard came tearing across the field, his fingers stuffed into his own ears, and kicked Mustafa hard in the shins. Mustafa seemed to come to himself. Harry, watching through the omnioculars again, saw that he looked exceptionally embarrassed, and had started shouting at the Vila, who had stopped dancing and were looking mutinous. "And unless I'm much mistaken, Mustafa is actually attempting to send off the Bulgarian team mascots," said Bagman's voice. "Now there's something we haven't seen before. Oh, this could turn nasty." It did. The Bulgarian beaters, Volkov and Bolchanov, landed on either side of Mustafa and began arguing furiously with him, gesticulating toward the leprechauns, who had now gleefully formed the words, "He, he, he." Mustafa was not impressed by the Bulgarians' arguments, however. He was jabbing his finger into the air, clearly telling them to get flying again, and when they refused, he gave 2 short blasts on his whistle. "2 penalties for Ireland," shouted Bagman, and the Bulgarian crowd howled with anger. "And Volkov and Volchanov had better get back on those brooms. Yes, there they go. And Troy takes the quaffle." Play now reached a level of ferocity beyond anything they had yet seen. The beaters on both sides were acting without mercy. Volkov and Volchanov in particular seemed not to care whether their clubs made contact with bludger or human as they swung them violently through the air. Dimitrov shot straight at Moran, who had the quaffle, nearly knocking her off her broom. "Foul!" roared the Irish supporters as one, all standing up in a great wave of green. "Foul!" echoed Ludo Bagman's magically magnified voice. Dimitrov skins Moran, deliberately flying to collide there, and it's got to be another penalty. Yes, there's the whistle. The leprechauns had risen into the air again, and this time they formed a giant hand, which was making a very rude sign indeed at the Vila across the field. At this, the Vila lost control. Instead of dancing, they launched themselves across the field and began throwing what seemed to be handfuls of fire at the leprechauns. Watching through his omnioculars, Harry saw that they didn't look remotely beautiful now. On the contrary, their faces were elongating into sharp, cruel-beaked bird heads, and long, scaly wings were bursting from their shoulders. "And that, boys," yelled Mr. Weasley over the tumult of the crowd below, "is why you should never go for looks alone." Ministry wizards were flooding onto the field to separate the Veela and the leprechauns, but with little success. Meanwhile, the pitched battle below was nothing to the one taking place above. Harry turned this way and that, staring through his omnioculars as the quaffle changed hands with the speed of a bullet. Levski, Dimitrov, Moran, Troy, Mullet, Libidova, Moranigan, Moran scores! But the cheers of the Irish supporters were barely heard over the shrieks of the Veela, the blasts now issuing from the ministry members' wands, and the furious roars of the Bulgarians. The game recommenced immediately. Now Levski had the quaffle, now Dimitrov. The Irish beater Quigley swung heavily at a passing bludger, and hit it as hard as possible toward Crumb, who did not duck quickly enough. It hit him full in the face. There was a deafening groan from the crowd. Crumb's nose looked broken. There was blood everywhere. But Hassan Mostafa didn't blow his whistle. He had become distracted, and Harry couldn't blame him. One of the Veela had thrown a handful of fire and set his broomtail alight. Harry wanted someone to realize that Crumb was injured. Even though he was supporting Ireland, Crumb was the most exciting player on the field. Ron obviously felt the same. "Time out! Come on, he can't play like that. Look at him. Look at Lynch," Harry yelled. For the Irish seeker had suddenly gone into a dive, and Harry was quite sure that this was no Wronski fate. This was the real thing. "He's seen the snitch," Harry shouted. "He's seen it. Look at him go." Half the crowd seemed to have realized what was happening. The Irish supporters rose in another great wave of green, screaming their seeker on. But Crumb was on his tail. How he could see where he was going, Harry had no idea. There were flecks of blood flying through the air behind him, but he was drawing level with Lynch now as the pair of them hurtled toward the ground again. "They're going to crash!" shrieked Hermione. "They're not!" roared Ron. "Lynch is!" yelled Harry. And he was right. For the second time, Lynch hit the ground with tremendous force and was immediately stampeded by a horde of angry Veela. "The snitch! Where's the snitch?" bellowed Charlie along the row. "He's got it! Crumb's got it! It's all over!" shouted Harry. Crumb, his red robes shining with blood from his nose, was rising gently into the air, his fist held high, a glint of gold in his hand. The scoreboard was flashing Bulgaria 160, Ireland 170 across the crowd, who didn't seem to have realized what had happened. Then, slowly, as though a great jumbo jet were revving up, the rumbling from the Ireland supporters grew louder and erupted into screams of delight. "Ireland wins!" Bagman shouted, who, like the Irish, seemed to be taken aback by the sudden end of the match. "Crumb gets the snitch, but Ireland wins!" "Good Lord, I don't think any of us were expecting that." "What did he catch the snitch for?" Ron bellowed, even as he jumped up and down, applauding with his hands over his head. "He ended it when Ireland were 160 points ahead, the idiot! He knew they were never going to catch up," Harry shouted back over all the noise, also applauding loudly. "The Irish chasers were too good. He wanted to end it on his terms, that's all." "He was very brave, wasn't he?" Hermione said, leaning forward to watch Crumb land as a swarm of meta-wizards blasted a path through the battling leprechauns and Veela to get to him. "He looks a terrible mess." Harry put his omnioculars to his eyes again. It was hard to see what was happening below because leprechauns were zooming delightedly all over the field, but he could just make out Crumb, surrounded by meta-wizards. He looked surlier than ever and refused to let them mop him up. His team members were around him, shaking their heads and looking dejected. A short way away, the Irish players were dancing gleefully in a shower of gold descending from their mascots. Flags were waving all over the stadium. The Irish national anthem blared from all sides. The villa were shrinking back into their usual beautiful selves now, though looking dispirited and forlorn. "Well, we fought bravely," said a gloomy voice behind Harry. He looked around. It was the Bulgarian Minister of Magic. "You can speak English," said Fudge, sounding outraged, "and you've been letting me mind everything all day." "Well, it was very funny," said the Bulgarian minister, shrugging. "And as the Irish team performs a lap of honor, flanked by their mascots, the Quidditch World Cup itself is brought into the top box," roared Bagman. Harry's eyes were suddenly dazzled by a blinding white light as the top box was magically illuminated so that everyone in the stands could see the inside. Squinting toward the entrance, he saw two panting wizards carrying a vast golden cup into the box, which they handed to Cornelius Fudge, who was still looking very disgruntled that he'd been using sign language all day for nothing. "Let's have a really loud hand for the gallant losers, Moldaria!" Bagman shouted, and up the stairs into the box came the 7 defeated Bulgarian players. The crowd below was applauding appreciatively. Harry could see thousands and thousands of omniocular lenses flashing and winking in their direction. One by one, the Bulgarians filed between the rows of seats in the box, and Bagman called out the name of each as they shook hands with their own minister, and then with Fudge. Crumb, who was last in line, looked a real mess. 2 black eyes were blooming spectacularly on his bloody face. He was still holding the snitch. Harry noticed that he seemed much less coordinated on the ground. He was slightly duck-footed and distinctly round-shouldered, but when Crumb's name was announced, the whole stadium gave him a resounding, ear-splitting roar. And then came the Irish team. Aidan Lynch was being supported by Moran and Connolly. The second crash seemed to have dazed him, and his eyes looked strangely unfocused, but he grinned happily as Troy and Quigley lifted the cup into the air and the crowd below thundered its approval. Harry's hands were numb with clapping. At last, when the Irish team had left the box to perform another lap of honor on their brooms, Aidan Lynch on the back of Connolly's, clutching hard around his waist and still grinning in a bemused sort of way, Bagman pointed his wand at his throat and muttered, "Quietus." "They'll be talking about this one for years," he said hoarsely. "A really unexpected twist, that. Shame it couldn't have lasted longer. Ah, yes, I owe you. How much?" For Fred and George had just scrambled over the backs of their seats and were standing in front of Ludo Bagman with broad grins on their faces, their hands outstretched. Chapter 9. The Dark Mark. "Don't tell your mother you've been gambling," Mr. Weasley implored Fred and George as they all made their way slowly down the purple-carpeted stairs. "Don't worry, Dad," said Fred gleefully. "We've got big plans for this money. We don't want it confiscated." Mr. Weasley looked for a moment as though he was going to ask what these big plans were, but seemed to decide upon reflection that he didn't want to know. They were soon caught up in the crowds now flooding out of the stadium and back to their campsites. Raucous singing was borne toward them on the night air as they retraced their steps along the lantern-lit path, and leprechauns kept shooting over their heads, cackling and waving their lanterns. When they finally reached the tents, nobody felt like sleeping at all, and given the level of noise around them, Mr. Weasley agreed that they could all have one last cup of cocoa together before turning in. They were soon arguing enjoyably about the match. Mr. Weasley got drawn into a disagreement about cobbing with Charlie, and it was only when Ginny fell asleep right at the tiny table and spilled hot chocolate all over the floor that Mr. Weasley called a halt to the verbal replays and insisted that everyone go to bed. Hermione and Ginny went into the next tent, and Harry and the rest of the Weasleys changed into pajamas and clambered into their bunks. From the other side of the campsite, they could still hear much singing and the odd echoing bang. "Oh, am I glad I am not on duty," muttered Mr. Weasley sleepily. "I wouldn't fancy having to go and tell the Irish they've got to stop celebrating." Harry, who was on a top bunk above Ron, lay staring up at the canvas ceiling of the tent, watching the glow of an occasional leprechaun lantern flying overhead, and picturing again some of Crumb's more spectacular moves. He was itching to get back on his own firebolt and try out the Wronski feint. Somehow, Oliver Wood had never managed to convey with all his wriggling diagrams what that move was supposed to look like. Harry saw himself in robes that had his name on the back, and imagined the sensation of hearing 100,000-strong crowd roar as Ludo Bagman's voice echoed throughout the stadium, "I give you Potter!" Harry never knew whether or not he had actually dropped off to sleep. His fantasies of flying like Crumb might well have slipped into actual dreams. All he knew was that quite suddenly, Mr. Weasley was shouting, "Get up, Ron, Harry! Come on now, get up, this is urgent!" Harry sat up quickly, and the top of his head hit canvas. "'Smatter," he said. Dimly, he could tell that something was wrong. The noises in the campsite had changed, the singing had stopped. He could hear screams and the sound of people running. He slipped down from the bunk and reached for his clothes. But Mr. Weasley, who had pulled on his jeans over his own pajamas, said, "No time, Harry. Just grab a jacket and get outside, quickly." Harry did as he was told and hurried out of the tent, Ron at his heels. By the light of the few fires that were still burning, he could see people running away into the woods, fleeing something that was moving across the field toward them, something that was emitting odd flashes of light and noises like gunfire. Loud jeering, roars of laughter, and drunken yells were drifting toward them. Then came a burst of strong green light which illuminated the scene. A crowd of wizards, tightly packed and moving together with wands pointing straight upward, was marching slowly across the field. Harry squinted at them. They didn't seem to have faces. Then he realized that their heads were hooded and their faces masked. High above them, floating along in midair, 4 struggling figures were being contorted into grotesque shapes. It was as though the masked wizards on the ground were puppeteers, and the people above them were marionettes, operated by invisible strings that rose from the wands into the air. 2 of the figures were very small. More wizards were joining the marching group, laughing and pointing up at the floating bodies. Tents crumpled and fell as the marching crowd swelled. Once or twice, Harry saw one of the marchers blast a tent out of his way with his wand. Several caught fire. The screaming grew louder. The floating people were suddenly illuminated as they passed over a burning tent, and Harry recognized one of them, Mr. Roberts, the campsite manager. The other 3 looked as though they might be his wife and children. One of the marchers below flipped Mrs. Roberts upside down with his wand. Her nightdress fell down to reveal voluminous drawers, and she struggled to cover herself up as the crowd below her screeched and hooted with glee. "That's sick," Ron muttered, watching the smallest Muggle child, who had begun to spin like a top 60 feet above the ground, his head flopping limply from side to side. "That is really sick." Hermione and Ginny came hurrying toward them, pulling coats over their nightdresses, with Mr. Weasley right behind them. At the same moment, Bill, Charlie, and Percy emerged from the boys' tent fully dressed, with their sleeves rolled up and their wands out. "We're going to help the Ministry," Mr. Weasley shouted over all the noise, rolling up his own sleeves. "You lot, get into the woods and stick together. I'll come and fetch you when we've sorted this out." Bill, Charlie, and Percy were already sprinting away toward the oncoming marchers. Mr. Weasley tore after them. Ministry wizards were dashing from every direction toward the source of the trouble. The crowd beneath the Roberts family was coming ever closer. "Come on," said Fred, grabbing Ginny's hand and starting to pull her toward the wood. Harry, Ron, Hermione, and George followed. They all looked back as they reached the trees. The crowd beneath the Roberts family was larger than ever. They could see the ministry wizards trying to get through it to the hooded wizards in the center, but they were having great difficulty. It looked as though they were scared to perform any spell that might make the Roberts family fall. The colored lanterns that had lit the path to the stadium had been extinguished. Dark figures were blundering through the trees. Children were crying. Anxious shouts and panicked voices were reverberating around them in the cold night air. Harry felt himself being pushed hither and thither by people whose faces he could not see. Then he heard Ron yell with pain. "What happened?" said Hermione anxiously, stopping so abruptly that Harry walked into her. "Ron, where are you? Oh, this is stupid. Lumos." She illuminated her wand and directed its narrow beam across the path. Ron was lying sprawled on the ground. "Tripped over a tree root," he said angrily, getting to his feet again. "Well, with feet that size, hard not to," said a drawling voice from behind them. Harry, Ron, and Hermione turned sharply. Draco Malfoy was standing alone nearby, leaning against a tree, looking utterly relaxed. His arms folded, he seemed to have been watching the scene at the campsite through a gap in the trees. Ron told Malfoy to do something that Harry knew he would never have dared say in front of Mrs. Weasley. "Language, Weasley," said Malfoy, his pale eyes glittering. "Hadn't you better be hurrying along now? You wouldn't like her spotted, would you?" He nodded at Hermione, and at the same moment a blast like a bomb sounded from the campsite, and a flash of green light momentarily lit the trees around them. "What's that supposed to mean?" said Hermione defiantly. "Granger, they're after muggles," said Malfoy. "Do you want to be showing off your knickers in midair? Because if you do, hang around. They're moving this way, and it would give us all a laugh." "Hermione's a witch," Harry snarled. "Have it your own way, Potter," said Malfoy, grinning maliciously. "If you think they can't spot a mudblood, stay where you are." "You watch your mouth," shouted Ron. Everybody present knew that mudblood was a very offensive term for a witch or wizard of Muggle parentage. "Never mind, Ron," said Hermione quickly, seizing Ron's arm to restrain him as he took a step toward Malfoy. There came a bang from the other side of the trees that was louder than anything they had heard. Several people nearby screamed. Malfoy chuckled softly. "Scare easily, don't they?" he said lazily. "I suppose your daddy told you all to hide? What's he up to? Trying to rescue the Muggles?" "Where are your parents?" said Harry, his temper rising. "Out there wearing masks, are they?" Malfoy turned his face to Harry, still smiling. "Well, if they were, I wouldn't be likely to tell you, would I, Potter?" "Oh, come on," said Hermione with a disgusted look at Malfoy. "Let's go and find the others." "Keep that big bushy head down, Granger," sneered Malfoy. "Come on," Hermione repeated, and she pulled Harry and Ron up the path again. "I'll bet you anything his dad is one of that masked lot," said Ron hotly. "Well, with any luck, the Ministry will catch him," said Hermione fervently. "Oh, I can't believe this. Where have the others got to?" Fred, George, and Ginny were nowhere to be seen, though the path was packed with plenty of other people, all looking nervously over their shoulders toward the commotion back at the campsite. A huddle of teenagers in pajamas was arguing vociferously a little way along the path. When they saw Harry, Ron, and Hermione, a girl with thick, curly hair turned and said quickly, "Oui, Madame Maxime, nous l'avons perdu." What?" said Ron. "Oh." The girl who had spoken turned her back on him, and as they walked on, they distinctly heard her say, "Hogwarts." "Beauxbatons," muttered Hermione. "Sorry?" said Harry. "They must go to Beauxbatons," said Hermione. "You know, Beauxbatons Academy of Magic." I read about it in An Appraisal of Magical Education in Europe. Oh, yeah. Right, said Harry. Fred and George can't have gone that far, said Ron, pulling out his wand, lighting it like Hermione's, and squinting up the path. Harry dug in the pockets of his jacket for his own wand, but it wasn't there. The only thing he could find was his omnioculars. Ah, no, I don't believe it. I've lost my wand. You're kidding. Ron and Hermione raised their wands high enough to spread the narrow beams of light farther on the ground. Harry looked all around him, but his wand was nowhere to be seen. Maybe it's back in the tent, said Ron. Maybe it fell out of your pocket when we were running, Hermione suggested anxiously. Yeah, said Harry, maybe. He usually kept his wand with him at all times in the wizarding world, and finding himself without it in the midst of a scene like this made him feel very vulnerable. A rustling noise nearby made all three of them jump. Winky the house elf was fighting her way out of a clump of bushes nearby. She was moving in a most peculiar fashion, apparently with great difficulty. It was as though someone invisible were trying to hold her back. "There is bad wizards about," she squeaked distractedly as she leaned forward and labored to keep running. "People high in the air. Winky is getting out of the way." And she disappeared into the trees on the other side of the path, panting and squeaking as she fought the force that was restraining her. "What's up with her?" said Ron, looking curiously after Winky. "Why can't she run properly?" "Bet she didn't ask permission to hide," said Harry. He was thinking of Dobby. Every time he had tried to do something the Malfoys wouldn't like, the house elf had been forced to start beating himself up. "You know, house elves get a very raw deal," said Hermione indignantly. "It's slavery, that's what it is. That Mr. Crouch made her go up to the top of the stadium and she was terrified. And he's got her bewitched so she can't even run when they start trampling tents. Why doesn't anyone do something about it?" "Well, the elves are happy, aren't they?" Ron said. "You heard old Winky back at the match. House elves is not supposed to have fun. That's what she likes, being bossed around." "It's people like you, Ron," Hermione began hotly, "who prop up rotten and unjust systems just because they're too lazy to—" Another loud bang echoed from the edge of the wood. "Let's just keep moving, shall we?" said Ron, and Harry saw him glance edgily at Hermione. Perhaps there was truth in what Malfoy had said. Perhaps Hermione was in more danger than they were. They set off again, Harry still searching his pockets, even though he knew his wand wasn't there. They followed the dark path deeper into the wood, still keeping an eye out for Fred, George, and Ginny. They passed a group of goblins who were cackling over a sack of gold that they had undoubtedly won betting on the match, and who seemed quite unperturbed by the trouble at the campsite. Farther still along the path, they walked into a patch of silvery light, and when they looked through the trees, they saw 3 tall and beautiful villas standing in a clearing, surrounded by a gaggle of young wizards, all of whom were talking very loudly. "I pull down about 100 sacks of galleons a year," one of them shouted. "I'm a dragon killer for the Committee for the Disposal of Dangerous Creatures." "No, you're not," yelled his friend. "You're a dishwasher at the Leaky Cauldron. But I'm a vampire hunter. I've killed about 90 so far." A third young wizard, whose pimples were visible even by the dim, silvery light of the villa, now cut in. "I'm about to become the youngest ever Minister of Magic, I am." Harry snorted with laughter. He recognized the pimply wizard. His name was Stan Shunpike, and he was in fact a conductor on the triple-decker night bus. He turned to tell Ron this, but Ron's face had gone oddly slack, and next second Ron was yelling, "Did I tell you I've invented a broomstick that'll reach Jupiter?" "Honestly," said Hermione, and she and Harry grabbed Ron firmly by the arms, wheeled him around, and marched him away. By the time the sounds of the villa and their admirers had faded completely, they were in the very heart of the wood. They seemed to be alone now. Everything was much quieter. Harry looked around. "I reckon we can just wait here, you know. We'll hear anyone coming a mile off." The words were hardly out of his mouth when Ludo Bagman emerged from behind a tree right ahead of them. Even by the feeble light of the two wands, Harry could see that a great change had come over Bagman. He no longer looked buoyant and rosy-faced. There was no more spring in his step. He looked very white and strained. "Who's that?" he said, blinking down at them, trying to make out their faces. "What are you doing in here all alone?" They looked at one another, surprised. "Well, there's a sort of riot going on," said Ron. Bagman stared at him. "What?" "At the campsite. Some people have got hold of a family of muggles." Bagman swore loudly. "Damn them," he said, looking quite distracted, and without another word he disappeared with a small pop. "Not exactly on top of things, Mr. Bagman, is he?" said Hermione, frowning. "He was a great beater, though," said Ron, leading the way off the path into a small clearing and sitting down on a patch of dry grass at the foot of a tree. "The Wimborne Wasps won the league 3 times in a row while he was with them." He took his small figure of Crumb out of his pocket, set it down on the ground, and watched it walk around. Like the real Crumb, the model was slightly duck-footed and round-shouldered, much less impressive on his splayed feet than on his broomstick. Harry was listening for noise from the campsite. Everything seemed much quieter. Perhaps the riot was over. "I hope the others are okay," said Hermione after a while. "They'll be fine," said Ron. "Imagine if your dad catches Lucius Malfoy," said Harry, sitting down next to Ron and watching the small figure of Crumb slouching over the fallen leaves. "He's always said he'd like to get something on him." "That'd wipe the smirk off old Draco's face all right," said Ron. "Those poor muggles, though," said Hermione nervously. "What if they can't get them down?" "They will," said Ron reassuringly. "They'll find a way." "Mad, though, to do something like that when the whole Ministry of Magic's out here tonight," said Hermione. "I mean, how do they expect to get away with it? Do you think they've been drinking? Or are they just—" But she broke off abruptly and looked over her shoulder. Harry and Ron looked quickly around too. It sounded as though someone was staggering toward their clearing. They waited, listening to the sounds of the uneven steps behind the dark trees. But the footsteps came to a sudden halt. "Hello?" called Harry. There was silence. Harry got to his feet and peered around the tree. It was too dark to see very far, but he could sense somebody standing just beyond the range of his vision. "Who's there?" he said. And then, without warning, the silence was wrecked by a voice unlike any they had heard in the wood, and it uttered not a panicked shout, but what sounded like a spell. "Mors Mordra!" And something vast, green and glittering, erupted from the patch of darkness Harry's eyes had been struggling to penetrate. It flew up over the treetops and into the sky. "What the—" gasped Ron as he sprang to his feet again, staring up at the thing that had appeared. For a split second, Harry thought it was another leprechaun formation. Then he realized that it was a colossal skull, comprised of what looked like emerald stars, with a serpent protruding from its mouth like a tongue. As they watched, it rose higher and higher, blazing in a haze of greenish smoke, etched against the black sky like a new constellation. Suddenly, the wood all around them erupted with screams. Harry didn't understand why, but the only possible cause was the sudden appearance of the skull, which had now risen high enough to illuminate the entire wood like some grisly neon sign. He scanned the darkness for the person who had conjured the skull, but he couldn't see anyone. "Who's there?" he called again. "Harry, come on, move!" Hermione had seized the collar of his jacket and was tugging him backward. "What's the matter?" Harry said, startled to see her face so white and terrified. "It's the Dark Mark, Harry," Hermione moaned, pulling him as hard as she could. "You know whose sign." "Voldemort's? Harry, come on!" Harry turned. Ron was hurriedly scooping up his miniature Crumb. The three of them started across the clearing. But before they had taken a few hurried steps, a series of popping noises announced the arrival of 20 wizards, appearing from thin air surrounding them. Harry whirled around, and in an instant, he registered one fact. Each of these wizards had his wand out, and every wand was pointing right at himself, Ron, and Hermione. Without pausing to think, he yelled, "Duck!" He seized the other two and pulled them down onto the ground. "Stupefy!" roared 20 voices. There was a blinding series of flashes, and Harry felt the hair on his head ripple as though a powerful wind had swept the clearing. Raising his head a fraction of an inch, he saw jets of fiery red light flying over them from the wizards' wands, crossing one another, bouncing off tree trunks, rebounding into the darkness. "Stop!" yelled a voice he recognized. "Stop! That's my son!" Harry's hair stopped blowing about. He raised his head a little higher. The wizard in front of him had lowered his wand. He rolled over and saw Mr. Weasley striding toward them, looking terrified. "Ron? Harry?" His voice sounded shaky. "Hermione? Are you all right?" "Out of the way, Arthur," said a cold, curt voice. It was Mr. Crouch. He and the other Ministry wizards were closing in on them. Harry got to his feet to face them. Mr. Crouch's face was taut with rage. "Which of you did it?" he snapped, his sharp eyes darting between them. "Which of you conjured the dark murk?" "We didn't do that," said Harry, gesturing up at the skull. "We didn't do anything," said Ron, who was rubbing his elbow and looking indignantly at his father. "What did you want to attack us for?" "Do not lie, sir," shouted Mr. Crouch. His wand was still pointing directly at Ron, and his eyes were popping. He looked slightly mad. "You have been discovered at the scene of the crime." "Barty," whispered a witch in a long woolen dressing gown. "They're kids, Barty. They'd never have been able to—" "Where did the mark come from, you three?" said Mr. Weasley quickly. "Over there," said Hermione shakily, pointing at the place where they had heard the voice. "There was someone behind the trees. They shouted words. An incantation." "Oh, stood over there, did they?" said Mr. Crouch, turning his popping eyes on Hermione now, disbelief etched all over his face. "Said an incantation, did they? You seem very well informed about how that mark is summoned, Missy." But none of the Ministry wizards, apart from Mr. Crouch, seemed to think it remotely likely that Harry, Ron, or Hermione had conjured the skull. On the contrary, at Hermione's words, they had all raised their wands again and were pointing in the direction she had indicated, squinting through the dark trees. "We're too late," said the witch in the woolen dressing gown, shaking her head. "They'll have disapparated." "I don't think so," said a wizard with a scrubby brown beard. It was Amos Diggory, Cedric's father. "Our stunners went right through those trees. There's a good chance we got them." "Amos, be careful," said a few of the wizards warningly, as Mr. Diggory squared his shoulders, raised his wand, marched across the clearing, and disappeared into the darkness. Hermione watched him vanish with her hands over her mouth. A few seconds later, they heard Mr. Diggory shout, "Yes, we got them. There's someone here, unconscious. But, blimey." "You've got someone?" shouted Mr. Crouch, sounding highly disbelieving. Who is it?" They heard snapping twigs, the rustling of leaves, and then crunching footsteps as Mr. Diggory re-emerged from behind the trees. He was carrying a tiny, limp figure in his arms. Harry recognized the tea towel at once. It was Winky. Mr. Crouch did not move or speak as Mr. Diggory deposited his elf on the ground at his feet. The other Ministry wizards were all staring at Mr. Crouch. For a few seconds, Crouch remained transfixed, his eyes blazing in his white face as he stared down at Winky. Then he appeared to come to life again. "This cannot be," he said jerkily. "No." He moved quickly around Mr. Diggory and strode off toward the place where he had found Winky. "No point, Mr. Crouch," Mr. Diggory called after him. "There's no one else there." But Mr. Crouch did not seem prepared to take his word for it. They could hear him moving around, and the rustling of leaves as he pushed the bushes aside, searching. "Bit embarrassing," Mr. Diggory said grimly, looking down at Winky's unconscious form. "Barty Crouch's house elf, I mean to say." "Come off it, Amos," said Mr. Weasley quietly. "You don't seriously think it was the elf? The dark mark's a wizard's sign. It requires a wand." "Yeah," said Mr. Diggory, "and she had a wand." "What?" said Mr. Weasley. "Here, look." Mr. Diggory held up a wand and showed it to Mr. Weasley. "Had it in her hand. So that's Clause 3 of the Code of Wand Use broken for a start. No non-human creature is permitted to carry or use a wand." Just then there was another pup, and Ludo Bagman apparated right next to Mr. Weasley. Looking breathless and disorientated, he spun on the spot, dawdling upward at the emerald green skull. "The dark mark," he panted, almost trampling Winky as he turned inquiringly to his colleagues. "Who did it? Did you get them? Barty, what's going on?" Mr. Crouch had returned empty-handed. His face was still ghostly white, and his hands and his toothbrush mustache were both twitching. "Where have you been, Barty?" said Bagman. "Why weren't you at the match? Your elf was saving you a seat, too. Gulping gargoyles." Bagman had just noticed Winky lying at his feet. "What happened to her?" "I have been busy, Ludo," said Mr. Crouch, still talking in the same jerky fashion, barely moving his lips. "And my elf has been stunned." "Stunned? By you lot, you mean? But why?" Comprehension dawned suddenly on Bagman's round, shiny face. He looked up at the skull, down at Winky, and then at Mr. Crouch. "No," he said. "Winky? Conjure the dark mark? She wouldn't know how. She'd need a wand for a start, and she had one," said Mr. Diggory. "I found her holding one, Ludo. If it's all right with you, Mr. Crouch, I think we should hear what she's got to say for herself." Crouch gave no sign that he had heard Mr. Diggory, but Mr. Diggory seemed to take his silence for assent. He raised his own wand, pointed it at Winky, and said, "Enervate." Winky stirred feebly. Her great brown eyes opened, and she blinked several times in a bemused sort of way. Watched by the silent wizards, she raised herself shakily into a sitting position. She caught sight of Mr. Diggory's feet, and slowly, tremulously raised her eyes to stare up into his face. Then, more slowly still, she looked up into the sky. Harry could see the floating skull reflected twice in her enormous, glassy eyes. She gave a gasp, looked wildly around the crowded clearing, and burst into terrified sobs. "Elf," said Mr. Diggory sternly, "do you know who I am? I am a member of the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures." Winky began to rock backward and forward on the ground, her breath coming in sharp bursts. Harry was reminded forcibly of Dobby in his moments of terrified disobedience. "As you see, elf, the dark mark was conjured here a short while ago," said Mr. Diggory, "and you were discovered moments later right beneath it. An explanation, if you please." I's not doing it, sir," Winky gasped. "I's not doing how, sir?" "You were found with a wand in your hand," barked Mr. Diggory, brandishing it in front of her. And as the wand caught the green light that was filling the clearing from the skull above, Harry recognized it. "Hey, that's mine," he said. Everyone in the clearing looked at him. "Excuse me?" said Mr. Diggory incredulously. "That's my wand," said Harry. "I dropped it." "You dropped it?" repeated Mr. Diggory in disbelief. "Is this a confession? You threw it aside after you conjured the mark?" "Amos, think who you're talking to," said Mr. Weasley very angrily. "Is Harry Potter likely to conjure the dark mark?" Of course not," mumbled Mr. Diggory, sorry, carried away. "I didn't drop it there anyway," said Harry, jerking his thumb toward the trees beneath the skull. "I missed it right after we got into the wood." "So," said Mr. Diggory, his eyes hardening as he turned to look at Winky again, cowering at his feet. "You found this wand, elf? And you picked it up and thought you'd have some fun with it, did you?" "I is not doing magic with it, sir," squealed Winky, tears streaming down the sides of her squashed and bulbous nose. I is just picking it up, sir. I is not making the dark mark, sir. I is not knowing how." "It wasn't her," said Hermione. She looked very nervous, speaking up in front of all these ministry wizards, yet determined all the same. "Winky's got a squeaky little voice, and the voice we heard doing the incantation was much deeper." She looked around at Harry and Ron, appealing for their support. "It didn't sound anything like Winky, did it?" "No," said Harry, shaking his head. "It definitely didn't sound like an elf." "Yeah, it was a human voice," said Ron. "Well, we'll soon see," growled Mr. Diggory, looking unimpressed. "There's a simple way of discovering the last spell a wand performed, elf. Did you know that?" Winky trembled and shook her head frantically, her ears flapping, as Mr. Diggory raised his own wand again and placed it tip to tip with Harry's. "Prior incantato!" roared Mr. Diggory. Harry heard Hermione gasp, horrified, as a gigantic serpent-tongued skull erupted from the point where the two wands met. But it was a mere shadow of the green skull high above them. It looked as though it were made of thick gray smoke, the ghost of a spell. "Dulitrius!" Mr. Diggory shouted, and the smoky skull vanished in a wisp of smoke. "So," said Mr. Diggory with a kind of savage triumph, looking down upon Winky, who was still shaking convulsively. "I is not doing it," she squealed, her eyes rolling in terror. I is not knowing how. I is a good elf. I isn't using wands. I isn't knowing how." "You've been caught red-handed, elf," Mr. Diggory roared. "Caught with the guilty wand in your hand." "Amos," said Mr. Weasley loudly. "Think about it. Precious few wizards know how to do that spell. Where would she have learned it?" "Perhaps Amos is suggesting," said Mr. Crouch, cold anger in every syllable, "that I routinely teach my servants to conjure the dark mark." There was a deeply unpleasant silence. Amos Diggory looked horrified. "Mr. Crouch, not at all. You have now come very close to accusing the two people in this clearing who are least likely to conjure that mark," barked Mr. Crouch. "Harry Potter and myself. I suppose you are familiar with the boy's story, Amos?" "Of course, everyone knows," muttered Mr. Diggory, looking highly discomforted. "And I trust you remember the many proofs I have given over a long career that I despise and detest the dark arts and those who practice them," Mr. Crouch shouted, his eyes bulging again. "Mr. Crouch, I never suggested you had anything to do with it," Amos Diggory muttered again, now reddening behind his scrubby brown beard. "If you accuse my elf, you accuse me, Diggory," shouted Mr. Crouch. "Where else would she have learned to conjure it?" She might have picked it up anywhere." "Precisely, Amos," said Mr. Weasley. "She might have picked it up anywhere." "Winky," he said kindly, turning to the elf, but she flinched as though he too was shouting at her. "Where exactly did you find Harry's wand?" Winky was twisting the hem of her tea towel so violently that it was fraying beneath her fingers. I is finding it, for, sir," she whispered. "There, in the trees, sir." "You see, Amos," said Mr. Weasley, "whoever conjured the mark could have disapparated right after they'd done it, leaving Harry's wand behind. A clever thing to do, not using their own wand, which could have betrayed them. and Winky here had the misfortune to come across the wand moments later and pick it up. But then she'd have been only a few feet away from the real culprit, said Mr. Diggory impatiently. Elf, did you see anyone? Winky began to tremble worse than ever. Her giant eyes flickered from Mr. Diggory to Ludo Bagman and onto Mr. Crouch. Then she gulped and said, I is seeing no one, sir. No one. Amos, said Mr. Crouch curtly, I am fully aware that in the ordinary course of events you would want to take Winky into your department for questioning. I ask you, however, to allow me to deal with her. Mr. Diggory looked as though he didn't think much of this suggestion at all, but it was clear to Harry that Mr. Crouch was such an important member of the ministry that he did not dare refuse him. You may rest assured that she will be punished, Mr. Crouch added coldly. Master, Winky stammered, looking up at Mr. Crouch, her eyes brimming with tears. Master, please. Mr. Crouch stared back. His face somehow sharpened, each line upon it more deeply etched. There was no pity in his gaze. Winky has behaved tonight in a manner I would not have believed possible, he said slowly. I told her to remain in the tent. I told her to stay there while I went to sort out the trouble, and I find that she disobeyed me. This means close. No! Shrieked Winky, prostrating herself at Mr. Crouch's feet. No, master, not clothes, not clothes. Harry knew that the only way to turn a house elf free was to present it with proper garments. It was pitiful to see the way Winky clutched at her tea towel as she sobbed over Mr. Crouch's feet. But she was frightened, Hermione burst out angrily, glaring at Mr. Crouch. Your elf's scared of heights, and those wizards in masks were levitating people. You can't blame her for wanting to get out of their way. Mr. Crouch took a step backward, freeing himself from contact with the elf, whom he was surveying as though she were something filthy and rotten that was contaminating his overshined shoes. I have no use for a house elf who disobeys me, he said coldly, looking over at Hermione. I have no use for a servant who forgets what is due to her master, and to her master's reputation. Winky was crying so hard that her sobs echoed around the clearing. There was a very nasty silence, which was ended by Mr. Weasley, who said quietly, Well, I think I'll take my lot back to the tent, if nobody's got any objections. Amos, that wand's told us all it can. If Harry could have it back, please. Mr. Diggory handed Harry his wand, and Harry pocketed it. Come on, you three, Mr. Weasley said quietly. But Hermione didn't seem to want to move. Her eyes were still upon the sobbing elf. Hermione, Mr. Weasley said more urgently. She turned and followed Harry and Ron out of the clearing and off through the trees. What's going to happen to Winky? Said Hermione the moment they had left the clearing. I don't know, said Mr. Weasley. The way they were treating her, said Hermione furiously. Mr. Diggory calling her elf all the time, and Mr. Crouch. He knows she didn't do it, and he's still going to sack her. He didn't care how frightened she'd been or how upset she was. It was like she wasn't even human. Well, she's not, said Ron. Hermione rounded on him. That doesn't mean she hasn't got feelings, Ron. It's disgusting the way— Hermione, I agree with you, said Mr. Weasley quickly, beckoning her on. But now is not the time to discuss elf rights. I want to get back to the tent as fast as we can. What happened to the others? We lost them in the dark, said Ron. Dad, why was everyone so uptight about that skull thing? I'll explain everything back at the tent, said Mr. Weasley tensely. But when they reached the edge of the wood, their progress was impeded. A large crowd of frightened-looking witches and wizards was congregated there, and when they saw Mr. Weasley coming toward them, many of them surged forward. What's going on in there? Who conjured it? Arthur, it's not him." "Of course it's not him," said Mr. Weasley impatiently. "We don't know who it was. It looks like they disapparated. Now excuse me, please. I want to get to bed." He led Harry, Ron, and Hermione through the crowd and back into the campsite. All was quiet now. There was no sign of the masked wizards, though several ruined tents were still smoking. Charlie's head was poking out of the boys' tent. "Dad, what's going on?" he called to the dark. "Fred, George, and Ginny got back okay, but the others, I've got them here," said Mr. Weasley, bending down and entering the tent. Harry, Ron, and Hermione entered after him. Bill was sitting at the small kitchen table, holding a bedsheet to his arm, which was bleeding profusely. Charlie had a large rip in his shirt, and Percy was sporting a bloody nose. Fred, George, and Ginny looked unhurt, though shaken. "Did you get them, Dad?" said Bill sharply. "The person who conjured the mark?" "No," said Mr. Weasley. "We found Barty Crouch's elf holding Harry's wand, but we're none the wiser about who actually conjured the mark." "What?" said Bill, Charlie, and Percy together. "Harry's wand?" said Fred. "Mr. Crouch's elf?" said Percy, sounding thunderstruck. With some assistance from Harry, Ron, and Hermione, Mr. Weasley explained what had happened in the woods. When they had finished their story, Percy swelled indignantly. "Well, Mr. Crouch is quite right to get rid of an elf like that," he said, "running away when he'd expressly told her not to, embarrassing him in front of the whole ministry. How would that have looked if she'd been brought up in front of the Department for the Regulation and Control?" "She didn't do anything. She was just in the wrong place at the wrong time," Hermione snapped at Percy, who looked very taken aback. Hermione had always got on fairly well with Percy, better indeed than any of the others. "Hermione, a wizard in Mr. Crouch's position can't afford a house elf who's going to run amok with a wand," said Percy pompously, recovering himself. "She didn't run amok," shouted Hermione. "She just picked it up off the ground. Look, can someone just explain what that skull thing was?" said Ron impatiently. "It wasn't hurting anyone. Why is it such a big deal?" "I told you it's you-know-who's symbol, Ron," said Hermione before anyone else could answer. "I read about it in the Rise and Fall of the Dark Arts." "And it hasn't been seen for 13 years, said Mr. Weasley quietly. "Of course people panicked. It was almost like seeing you-know-who back again." "I don't get it," said Ron, frowning. "I mean, it's still only a shape in the sky." "Ron, you-know-who and his followers sent the dark mark into the air whenever they kill," said Mr. Weasley. "The terror it inspired. You have no idea. You're too young. Just picture coming home and finding the dark mark hovering over your house, and knowing what you're about to find inside." Mr. Weasley winced. Everyone's worst fear. The very worst. There was silence for a moment. Then Bill, removing the sheet from his arm to check on his cut, said, "Well, it didn't help us tonight, whoever conjured it. It scared the Death Eaters away the moment they saw it. They all disapparated before we got near enough to unmask any of them. We caught the Robertses before they hit the ground, though. They're having their memories modified right now." "Death Eaters?" said Harry. "What are Death Eaters?" "It's what you-know-who's supporters called themselves," said Bill. "I think we saw what's left of them tonight. The ones who managed to keep themselves out of Azkaban, anyway." "We can't prove it was them, though," said Mr. Weasley. "Though it probably was," he added hopelessly. "Yeah, I bet it was," said Ron suddenly. "Dad, we met Draco Malfoy in the woods, and he as good as told us his dad was one of those nutters in masks, and we all know the Malfoys were right in with you-know-who." "But what were Voldemort's supporters?" Harry began. Everybody flinched. Like most of the wizarding world, the Weasleys always avoided saying Voldemort's name. "Sorry," said Harry quickly. "What were you-know-who's supporters up to, levitating muggles? I mean, what was the point?" "The point?" said Mr. Weasley with a hollow laugh. "Harry, that's their idea of fun. Half the muggle killings back when you-know-who was in power were done for fun. I suppose they had a few drinks tonight and couldn't resist reminding us all that lots of them are still at large. A nice little reunion for them," he finished disgustedly. "But if they were the Death Eaters, why did they disapparate when they saw the dark mark?" said Ron. "They'd have been pleased to see it, wouldn't they?" "Use your brains, Ron," said Bill. "If they really were Death Eaters, they worked very hard to keep out of Azkaban when you-know-who lost power, and told all sorts of lies about him forcing them to kill and torture people. I bet they'd be even more frightened than the rest of us to see him come back. They denied they'd ever been involved with him when he lost his powers and went back to their daily lives. I don't reckon he'd be over-pleased with them. Do you?" "So, whoever conjured the dark mark," said Hermione slowly, "were they doing it to show support for the Death Eaters, or to scare them away?" "Your guess is as good as ours, Hermione," said Mr. Weasley, "but I'll tell you this. It was only the Death Eaters who ever knew how to conjure it. I'd be very surprised if the person who did it hadn't been a Death Eater once, even if they're not now. Listen, it's very late, and if your mother hears what's happened, she'll be worried sick. We'll get a few more hours sleep, and then try and get an early portkey out of here." Harry got back into his bunk with his head buzzing. He knew he ought to feel exhausted. It was nearly 3 in the morning, but he felt wide awake and worried. 3 days ago, it felt like much longer, but it had only been 3 days. He had awoken with his scar burning, and tonight, for the first time in 13 years, Lord Voldemort's mark had appeared in the sky. What did these things mean? He thought of the letter he had written to Sirius before leaving Privet Drive. Would Sirius have gotten it yet? When would he reply? Harry lay looking up at the canvas, but no flying fantasies came to him now to ease him to sleep, and it was a long time after Charlie's snores filled the tent that Harry finally dozed off. Chapter 10. Mayhem at the Ministry. Mr. Weasley woke them after only a few hours' sleep. He used magic to pack up the tents, and they left the campsite as quickly as possible, passing Mr. Roberts at the door of his cottage. Mr. Roberts had a strange, dazed look about him, and he waved them off with a vague, "Merry Christmas." "He'll be all right," said Mr. Weasley quietly as they marched off onto the moor. "Sometimes when a person's memory's modified, it makes him a bit disorientated for a while, and that was a big thing they had to make him forget." They heard urgent voices as they approached the spot where the portkeys lay, and when they reached it, they found a great number of witches and wizards gathered around Basil, the keeper of the portkeys, all clamoring to get away from the campsite as quickly as possible. Mr. Weasley had a hurried discussion with Basil. They joined the queue and were able to take an old rubber tire back to Stoatshead Hill before the sun had really risen. They walked back through Otteries and Catchpole and up the damp lane toward the burrow in the dawn light, talking very little because they were so exhausted, and thinking longingly of their breakfast. As they rounded the corner and the burrow came into view, a cry echoed along the lane. "Oh, thank goodness, thank goodness!" Mrs. Weasley, who had evidently been waiting for them in the front yard, came running toward them, still wearing her bedroom slippers, her face pale and strained, a rolled-up copy of the Daily Prophet clutched in her hand. "Arthur, I've been so worried, so worried." She flung her arms around Mr. Weasley's neck, and the Daily Prophet fell out of her limp hand onto the ground. Looking down, Harry saw the headline, "Scenes of Terror at the Quidditch World Cup," complete with a twinkling black and white photograph of the dark mark over the treetops. "You're all right," Mrs. Weasley muttered distractedly, releasing Mr. Weasley and staring around at them all with red eyes. "You're alive. Oh, boys." And to everybody's surprise, she seized Fred and George and pulled them both into such a tight hug that their heads banged together. "Ouch, Mom, you're strangling us." "I shouted at you before you left," Mrs. Weasley said, starting to sob. "It's all I've been thinking about. What if you know who had got you, and the last thing I ever said to you was that you didn't get enough OWLs? Oh, Fred, George." "Come on now, Molly, we're all perfectly okay," said Mr. Weasley soothingly, prizing her off the twins and leading her back toward the house. "Bill," he added in an undertone, "pick up that paper. I want to see what it says." When they were all crammed into the tiny kitchen and Hermione had made Mrs. Weasley a cup of very strong tea, into which Mr. Weasley insisted on pouring a shot of Ogden's old fire whiskey, Bill handed his father the newspaper. Mr. Weasley scanned the front page while Percy looked over his shoulder. "I knew it," said Mr. Weasley heavily. "Ministry blunders, culprits not apprehended, lax security, dark wizards running unchecked, national disgrace. Who wrote this? Of course, Rita Skeeter." "That woman's got it in for the Ministry of Magic," said Percy furiously. "Last week she was saying we're wasting our time quibbling about cauldron thickness when we should be stamping out vampires. As if it wasn't specifically stated in paragraph 12 of the Guidelines for the Treatment of Non-Wizard Part Humans. "Do us a favor, Perce," said Bill, yawning, "and shut up." "I'm mentioned," said Mr. Weasley, his eyes widening behind his glasses as he reached the bottom of the Daily Prophet article. "Where?" spluttered Mrs. Weasley, choking on her tea and whiskey. "If I'd seen that, I'd have known you were alive." "Not by name," said Mr. Weasley. "Listen to this. If the terrified wizards and witches who waited breathlessly for news at the edge of the wood expected reassurance from the Ministry of Magic, they were sadly disappointed. A ministry official emerged sometime after the appearance of the Dark Mark, alleging that nobody had been hurt, but refusing to give any more information. Whether this statement will be enough to quash the rumors that several bodies were removed from the woods an hour later remains to be seen." "Oh, really?" said Mr. Weasley in exasperation, handing the paper to Percy. "Nobody was hurt. What was I supposed to say? Rumors that several bodies were removed from the woods. Well, there certainly will be rumors now she's printed that." He heaved a deep sigh. "Molly, I'm going to have to go into the office. This is going to take some smoothing over." "I'll come with you, Father," said Percy importantly. "Mr. Crouch will need all hands on deck, and I can give him my cauldron report in person." He bustled out of the kitchen. Mrs. Weasley looked most upset. "Arthur, you're supposed to be on holiday. This hasn't got anything to do with your office. Surely they can handle this without you?" "I've got to go, Molly," said Mr. Weasley. "I've made things worse. I'll just change into my robes and I'll be off." "Mrs. Weasley," said Harry suddenly, unable to contain himself. "Hedwig hasn't arrived with a letter for me, has she?" "Hedwig, dear?" said Mrs. Weasley distractedly. No, there hasn't been any post at all." Ron and Hermione looked curiously at Harry. With a meaningful look at both of them, he said, "All right if I go and dump my stuff in your room, Ron?" "Yeah, think I will too," said Ron at once. "Hermione?" "Yes," she said quickly, and the three of them marched out of the kitchen and up the stairs. "What's up, Harry?" said Ron the moment they had closed the door of the attic room behind them. "There's something I haven't told you," Harry said. "On Saturday morning, I woke up with my scar hurting again." Ron's and Hermione's reactions were almost exactly as Harry had imagined them back in his bedroom on Privet Drive. Hermione gasped and started making suggestions at once, mentioning a number of reference books, and everybody from Albus Dumbledore to Madame Pomfrey, the Hogwarts nurse. Ron simply looked dumbstruck. But he wasn't there, was he? You know who? I mean, last time your scar kept hurting, he was at Hogwarts, wasn't he? I'm sure he wasn't on Privet Drive, said Harry, but I was dreaming about him. Him and Peter, you know, Wormtail. I can't remember all of it now, but they were plotting to kill someone. He had teetered for a moment on the verge of saying me, but couldn't bring himself to make Hermione look any more horrified than she already did. It was only a dream, said Ron bracingly. Just a nightmare. Yeah, but was it though? Said Harry, turning to look out of the window at the brightening sky. It's weird, isn't it? My scar hurts, and 3 days later the Death Eaters are on the march and Voldemort's signs up in the sky again. Don't say she's name, Ron hissed through gritted teeth. And remember what Professor Trelawney said? Harry went on, ignoring Ron. At the end of last year, Professor Trelawney was their divination teacher at Hogwarts. Hermione's terrified look vanished as she let out a derisive snort. Oh, Harry, you aren't going to pay attention to anything that old fraud says. You weren't there, said Harry. You didn't hear her. This time was different. I told you, she went into a trance, a real one, and she said the Dark Lord would rise again, greater and more terrible than ever before. And he'd manage it because his servant was going to go back to him. And that night Wormtail escaped. There was a silence in which Ron fidgeted absent-mindedly with a hole in his Chudley Cannon's bedspread. Why were you asking if Hedwig had come, Harry? Hermione asked. Are you expecting a letter? I told Sirius about my scar, said Harry, shrugging. I'm waiting for his answer. Good thinking, said Ron, his expression clearing. I bet Sirius'll know what to do. I hoped he'd get back to me quickly, said Harry. But we don't know where Sirius is. He could be in Africa or somewhere, couldn't he? Said Hermione reasonably. Hedwig's not going to manage that journey in a few days. Yeah, I know, said Harry, but there was a leaden feeling in his stomach as he looked out of the window at the Hedwig-free sky. Come and have a game of Quidditch in the orchard, Harry, said Ron. Come on, 3 on 3. Bill and Charlie and Fred and George will play. You can try out the Ronsky Fate. Ron, said Hermione in an I don't think you're being very sensitive sort of voice. Harry doesn't want to play Quidditch right now. He's worried, and he's tired. We all need to go to bed. Yeah, I want to play Quidditch, said Harry suddenly. Hang on, I'll get my firebolt. Hermione left the room, muttering something that sounded very much like toys. Neither Mr. Weasley nor Percy was at home much over the following week. Both left the house each morning before the rest of the family got up, and returned well after dinner every night. It's been an absolute uproar, Percy told them importantly the Sunday evening before they were due to return to Hogwarts. I've been putting out fires all week. People keep sending howlers, and of course if you don't open a howler straight away, it explodes. Scorch marks all over my desk, and my best quill reduced to cinders. Why are they all sending howlers? Asked Ginny, who was mending her copy of 1000 Magical Herbs and Fungi with Stello tape on the rug in front of the living room fire. Complaining about security at the World Cup, said Percy. They want compensation for their ruined property. Mundungus Fletcher's put in a claim for a 12-bedroom tent with ensuite jacuzzi, but I've got his number. I know for a fact he was sleeping under a cloak propped on sticks. Mrs. Weasley glanced at the grandfather clock in the corner. Harry liked this clock. It was completely useless if you wanted to know the time, but otherwise very informative. It had 9 golden hands, and each of them was engraved with one of the Weasley family's names. There were no numerals around the face, but descriptions of where each family member might be. Home, school, and work were there, but there was also traveling, lost, hospital, prison, and, in the position where the number 12 would be on a normal clock, mortal peril. 8 of the hands were currently pointing to the home position, but Mr. Weasley's, which was the longest, was still pointing to work. Mrs. Weasley sighed. "Your father hasn't had to go into the office on weekends since the days of you-know-who," she said. "They're working him far too hard. His dinner's going to be ruined if he doesn't come home soon." "Well, Father feels he's got to make up for his mistake at the match, doesn't he?" said Percy. "If truth be told, he was a tad unwise to make a public statement without clearing it with his head of department first. Don't you dare blame your father for what that wretched Skeeter woman wrote," said Mrs. Weasley, flaring up at once. "If Dad hadn't said anything, old Rita would have just said it was disgraceful that nobody from the minister had commented," said Bill, who was playing chess with Ron. "Rita Skeeter never makes anyone look good. Remember she interviewed all the Gringotts Charmbreakers once and called me a long-haired pillock?" "Well, it is a bit long, dear," said Mrs. Weasley gently. "If you'd just let me—" "No, Mom." Rain lashed against the living room window. Hermione was immersed in the Standard Book of Spells, Grade 4, copies of which Mrs. Weasley had bought for her, Harry, and Ron in Diagon Alley. Charlie was darning a fireproof balaclava. Harry was polishing his firebolt, the broomstick servicing kit Hermione had given him for his 13th birthday, open at his feet. Fred and George were sitting in a far corner, quills out, talking in whispers, their heads bent over a piece of parchment. "What are you two up to?" said Mrs. Weasley sharply, her eyes on the twins. "Homework," said Fred vaguely. "Don't be ridiculous, you're still on holiday," said Mrs. Weasley. "Yeah, we've left it a bit late," said George. "You're not by any chance writing out a new order form, are you?" said Mrs. Weasley shrewdly. "You wouldn't be thinking of restarting Weasley's Wizard Wheezes by any chance?" "Now, Mom," said Fred, looking up at her, a pained look on his face. "If the Hogwarts Express crashed tomorrow and George and I died, how would you feel to know that the last thing we ever heard from you was an unfounded accusation?" Everyone laughed, even Mrs. Weasley. "Oh, your father's coming," she said suddenly, looking up at the clock again. Mr. Weasley's hand had suddenly spun from work to traveling. A second later, it had shuddered to a halt on home with the others, and they heard him calling from the kitchen. "Coming, Arthur," called Mrs. Weasley, hurrying out of the room. A few moments later, Mr. Weasley came into the warm living room, carrying his dinner on a tray. He looked completely exhausted. "Well, the fat's really in the fire now," he told Mrs. Weasley as he sat down in an armchair near the hearth and toyed unenthusiastically with his somewhat shriveled cauliflower. "Rita Skeeter's been ferreting around all week, looking for more ministry mess-ups to report. And now she's found out about poor old Bertha going missing. So that'll be the headline in the Prophet tomorrow. I told Bagman he should have sent someone to look for her ages ago. Mr. Crouch has been saying it for weeks and weeks," said Percy swiftly. "Crouch is very lucky Rita hasn't found out about Winky," said Mr. Weasley irritably. "There'd be a week's worth of headlines in his house elf being caught holding the wand that conjured the dark mark." "I thought we were all agreed that that elf, while irresponsible, did not conjure the mark," said Percy hotly. "If you ask me, Mr. Crouch is very lucky no one at the Daily Prophet knows how mean he is to elves," said Hermione angrily. "Now look here, Hermione," said Percy. "A high-ranking ministry official like Mr. Crouch deserves unswerving obedience from his servants." "His slave, you mean," said Hermione, her voice rising passionately. "Because he didn't pay Winky, did he?" "I think you'd all better go upstairs and check that you've packed properly," said Mrs. Weasley, breaking up the argument. "Come on now, all of you." Harry repacked his broomstick servicing kit, put his firebolt over his shoulder, and went back upstairs with Ron. The rain sounded even louder at the top of the house, accompanied by loud whistlings and moans from the wind, not to mention sporadic howls from the ghoul who lived in the attic. Pigridgeon began twittering and zooming around his cage when they entered. The sight of the half-packed trunks seemed to have sent him into a frenzy of excitement. "Bung him some owl treats," said Ron, throwing a packet across to Harry. "It might shut him up." Harry poked a few owl treats through the bars of Pigwidgeon's cage, then turned to his trunk. Hedwig's cage stood next to it, still empty. "It's been over a week," Harry said, looking at Hedwig's deserted perch. "Ron, you don't reckon Sirius has been caught, do you?" "Nah, it would have been in the Daily Prophet," said Ron. "The Ministry would want to show they'd caught someone, wouldn't they?" "Yeah, I suppose. Look, here's the stuff Mum got for you in Diagon Alley, and she's got some gold out of her vault for you, and she's washed all your socks." He heaved a pile of parcels onto Harry's cat bed and dropped the money bag and a load of socks next to it. Harry started unwrapping the shopping. Apart from the Standard Book of Spells Grade 4 by Miranda Goshawk, he had a handful of new quills, a dozen rolls of parchment, and refills for his potion-making kit. He had been running low on Spine of Lionfish and Essence of Belladonna. He was just piling underwear into his cauldron when Ron made a loud noise of disgust behind him. "What is that supposed to be?" He was holding up something that looked to Harry like a long maroon velvet dress. It had a moldy-looking lace frill at the collar and matching lace cuffs. There was a knock on the door, and Mrs. Weasley entered, carrying an armful of freshly laundered Hogwarts robes. "Here you are," she said, sorting them into 2 piles. "Now mind you pack them properly so they don't crease." "Mum, you've given me Ginny's new dress," said Ron, handing it out to her. "Of course I haven't," said Mrs. Weasley. "That's for you. Dress robes." "What?" said Ron, looking horror-struck. "Dress robes," repeated Mrs. Weasley. "It says on your school list that you're supposed to have dress robes this year, robes for formal occasions." "You've got to be kidding," said Ron in disbelief. "I'm not wearing that, no way." "Everyone wears them, Ron," said Mrs. Weasley crossly. "They're all like that. Your father's got some for smart parties." "I'll go starkers before I put that on," said Ron stubbornly. "Don't be so silly," said Mrs. Weasley. "You've got to have dress robes. They're on your list. I got some for Harry, too. Show him, Harry." In some trepidation, Harry opened the last parcel on his cat bed. It wasn't as bad as he had expected, however. His dress robes didn't have any lace on them at all. In fact, they were more or less the same as his school ones, except that they were bottle green instead of black. "I thought they'd bring out the color of your eyes, dear," said Mrs. Weasley fondly. "Well, they're okay," said Ron angrily, looking at Harry's robes. "Why couldn't I have some like that?" "Because, well, I had to get yours second-hand, and there wasn't a lot of choice," said Mrs. Weasley, flushing. Harry looked away. He would willingly have split all the money in his Grindelwald's vault with the Weasleys, but he knew they would never take it. "I'm never wearing them," Ron was saying stubbornly. "Never." "Fine," snapped Mrs. Weasley. "Go naked. And Harry, make sure you get a picture of him. Goodness knows I could do with a laugh." She left the room, slamming the door behind her. There was a funny spluttering noise from behind them. Pigwidgeon was choking on an overlarge owl treat. "Why is everything I own rubbish?" said Ron furiously, striding across the room to unstick Pigwidgeon's beak. Chapter 11. Aboard the Hogwarts Express. There was a definite end of the holidays gloom in the air when Harry awoke next morning. Heavy rain was still splattering against the window as he got dressed in jeans and a sweatshirt. They would change into their school robes on the Hogwarts Express. He, Ron, Fred, and George had just reached the first-floor landing on their way down to breakfast when Mrs. Weasley appeared at the foot of the stairs, looking harassed. "Arthur," she called up the staircase. "Arthur? Urgent message from the ministry." Harry flattened himself against the wall as Mr. Weasley came clattering past with his robes on back to front and hurtled out of sight. When Harry and the others entered the kitchen, they saw Mrs. Weasley rummaging anxiously in the drawers. "I've got a quill here somewhere," and Mr. Weasley bending over the fire talking to... Harry shut his eyes hard and opened them again to make sure that they were working properly. Amos Diggory's head was sitting in the middle of the flames, like a large bearded egg. It was talking very fast, completely unperturbed by the sparks flying around it and the flames licking its ears. Muggle neighbors heard bangs and shouting, so they went and called those, please men. "Arthur, you've got to get over there." "Here," said Mrs. Weasley breathlessly, pushing a piece of parchment, a bottle of ink, and a crumpled quill into Mr. Weasley's hands. "It's a real stroke of luck I heard about it," said Mr. Diggory's head. "I had to come into the office early to send a couple of owls, and I found the improper use of magic lot all setting off. If Rita Skeeter gets hold of this one, Arthur—" "What does Mad Eye say happened?" asked Mr. Weasley, unscrewing the ink bottle, loading up his quill and preparing to take notes. Mr. Diggory's head rolled its eyes. "Says he heard an intruder in his yard. Says he was creeping toward the house but was ambushed by his dustbins." "What did the dustbins do?" asked Mr. Weasley, scribbling frantically. "Made one hell of a noise and fired rubbish everywhere, as far as I can tell," said Mr. Diggory. "Apparently one of them was still rocketing around when the policemen turned up." Mr. Weasley groaned. "And what about the intruder?" "Arthur, you know Mad Eye," said Mr. Diggory's head, rolling its eyes again. "Someone creeping into his yard in the dead of night? More likely there's a very shell-shocked cat wandering around somewhere covered in potato peelings. But if the improper use of magic lot get their hands on Mad Eye, he's had it. Think of his record. We've got to get him off on a minor charge, something in your department. What are exploding dustbins worth?" "Might be a caution," said Mr. Weasley, still writing very fast, his brow furrowed. "Mad Eye didn't use his wand? He didn't actually attack anyone? I'll bet he leapt out of bed and started jinxing everything he could reach through the window," said Mr. Diggory. "But they'll have a job proving it. There aren't any casualties." "All right, I'm off," Mr. Weasley said, and he stuffed the parchment with his notes on it into his pocket and dashed out of the kitchen again. Mr. Diggory's head looked around at Mrs. Weasley. "Sorry about this, Molly," it said more calmly. "Bothering you so early and everything. But Arthur's the only one who can get Mad Eye off, and Mad Eye's supposed to be starting his new job today. Why, he had to choose last night." "Never mind, Amos," said Mrs. Weasley. "Sure you won't have a bit of toast or anything before you go?" "Oh, go on then," said Mr. Diggory. Mrs. Weasley took a piece of buttered toast from a stack on the kitchen table, put it into the fire tongs, and transferred it into Mr. Diggory's mouth. "Farks," he said in a muffled voice, and then, with a small pop, vanished. Harry could hear Mr. Weasley calling hurried goodbyes to Bill, Charlie, Percy, and the girls. Within 5 minutes he was back in the kitchen, his robes on the right way now, dragging a comb through his hair. "I'd better hurry. You have a good term, boys," said Mr. Weasley to Harry, Ron, and the twins, fastening a cloak over his shoulders and preparing to disapparate. "Molly, are you going to be all right taking the kids to King's Cross?" "Of course I will," she said. "You just look after Mad Eye. We'll be fine." As Mr. Weasley vanished, Bill and Charlie entered the kitchen. "Did someone say Mad Eye?" Bill asked. "What's he been up to now?" "He says someone tried to break into his house last night," said Mrs. Weasley. "Mad Eye Moody?" said George thoughtfully, spreading marmalade on his toast. "Isn't he that nutter? Your father thinks very highly of Mad-Eye Moody," said Mrs. Weasley sternly. "Yeah, well, Dad collects plugs, doesn't he?" said Fred quietly, as Mrs. Weasley left the room. "Birds of a feather." "Moody was a great wizard in his time," said Bill. "He's an old friend of Dumbledore's, isn't he?" said Charlie. "Dumbledore's not what you'd call normal, though, is he?" said Fred. "I mean, I know he's a genius and everything." "Who is Mad-Eye?" asked Harry. "He's retired. Used to work at the ministry," said Charlie. "I met him once when Dad took me in to work with him. He was an Auror, one of the best. A dark wizard catcher," he added, seeing Harry's blank look. "Half the cells in Azkaban are full because of him. He made himself loads of enemies, though. The families of people he caught, mainly. And I heard he's been getting really paranoid in his old age. Doesn't trust anyone anymore. Sees dark wizards everywhere." Bill and Charlie decided to come and see everyone off at King's Cross Station, but Percy, apologizing most profusely, said that he really needed to get to work. "I just can't justify taking more time off at the moment," he told them. "Mr. Crouch is really starting to rely on me." "Yeah, you know what, Percy?" said George seriously. "I reckon you'll know your name soon." Mrs. Weasley had braved the telephone in the village post office to order 3 ordinary Muggle taxis to take them into London. "Arthur tried to borrow ministry cars for us," Mrs. Weasley whispered to Harry as they stood in the rain-washed yard, watching the taxi drivers heaving 6 heavy Hogwarts trunks into their cars. "But there weren't any to spare. Oh dear, they don't look happy, do they?" Harry didn't like to tell Mrs. Weasley that Muggle taxi drivers rarely transported overexcited owls, and Pigwidgeon was making an ear-splitting racket. Nor did it help that a number of Filibuster's fabulous no-heat wet start fireworks went off unexpectedly when Fred's trunk sprang open, causing the driver carrying it to yell with fright and pain as Crookshanks clawed his way up the man's leg. The journey was uncomfortable, owing to the fact that they were jammed in the back of the taxis with their trunks. Crookshanks took quite a while to recover from the fireworks, and by the time they entered London, Harry, Ron, and Hermione were all severely scratched. They were very relieved to get out at King's Cross, even though the rain was coming down harder than ever, and they got soaked carrying their trunks across the busy road and into the station. Harry was used to getting onto platform 9 3/4 by now. It was a simple matter of walking straight through the apparently solid barrier dividing platforms 9 and 10. The only tricky part was doing this in an unobtrusive way, so as to avoid attracting Muggle attention. They did it in groups today. Harry, Ron, and Hermione, the most conspicuous, since they were accompanied by Pigwidgeon and Crookshanks, went first. They leaned casually against the barrier, chatting unconcernedly, and slid sideways through it. And as they did so, platform 9 3/4 materialized in front of them. The Hogwarts Express, a gleaming scarlet steam engine, was already there, clouds of steam billowing from it, through which the many Hogwarts students and parents on the platform appeared like dark ghosts. Pigwidgeon became noisier than ever in response to the hooting of many owls through the mist. Harry, Ron, and Hermione set off to find seats, and were soon stowing their luggage in a compartment halfway along the train. They then hopped back down onto the platform to say goodbye to Mrs. Weasley, Bill, and Charlie. "I might be seeing you all sooner than you think," said Charlie, grinning, as he hugged Ginny goodbye. "Why?" said Fred keenly. "You'll see," said Charlie. "Just don't tell Percy I mentioned it. It's classified information until such time as the ministry sees fit to release it, after all. Yeah, I sort of wish I were back at Hogwarts this year," said Bill, hands in his pockets, looking almost wistfully at the train. "Why?" said George impatiently. "You're going to have an interesting year," said Bill, his eyes twinkling. "I might even get time off to come and watch a bit of it." "A bit of what?" said Ron. But at that moment the whistle blew, and Mrs. Weasley chivied them toward the train doors. "Thanks for having us to stay, Mrs. Weasley," said Hermione as they climbed on board, closed the door, and leaned out of the window to talk to her. "Yeah, thanks for everything, Mrs. Weasley," said Harry. "Oh, it was my pleasure, dears," said Mrs. Weasley. "I'd invite you for Christmas, but, well, I expect you are all going to want to stay in Hogwarts, what with one thing and another." "Mom," said Ron irritably, "what do you three know that we don't?" "You'll find out this evening, I expect," said Mrs. Weasley, smiling. "It's going to be very exciting. Mind you, I'm very glad they've changed the rules." "What rules?" said Harry, Ron, Fred, and George together. "I'm sure Professor Dumbledore will tell you. Now behave, won't you? Won't you, Fred? And you, George?" The pistons hissed loudly, and the train began to move. "Tell us what's happening at Hogwarts," Fred bellowed out of the window as Mrs. Weasley, Bill, and Charlie sped away from them. "What rules are they changing?" But Mrs. Weasley only smiled and waved. Before the train had rounded the corner, she, Bill, and Charlie had disapparated. Harry, Ron, and Hermione went back to their compartment. The thick rain splattering the windows made it very difficult to see out of them. Ron undid his trunk, pulled out his maroon dress robes, and flung them over Pigwidgeon's cage to muffle his hooting. "Bagman wanted to tell us what's happening at Hogwarts," he said grumpily, sitting down next to Harry. "At the World Cup, remember? But my own mother won't say." "Wonder what—" "Shh!" Hermione whispered suddenly, pressing her finger to her lips and pointing toward the compartment next to theirs. Harry and Ron listened, and heard a familiar drawling voice drifting in through the open door. "Father actually considered sending me to Durmstrang rather than Hogwarts, you know. He knows the headmaster, you see. Well, you know his opinion of Dumbledore. The man's such a mudblood lover, and Durmstrang doesn't admit that sort of riffraff. But Mother didn't like the idea of me going to school so far away. Father says Durmstrang takes a far more sensible line than Hogwarts about the dark arts. Durmstrang students actually learn them, not just the defense rubbish we do." Hermione got up, tiptoed to the compartment door, and slid it shut, blocking out Malfoy's voice. "So he thinks Durmstrang would have suited him, does he?" she said angrily. "I wish he had gone, then we wouldn't have to put up with him." "Durmstrang's another wizarding school?" said Harry. "Yes," said Hermione sniffily, "and it's got a horrible reputation. According to an appraisal of magical education in Europe, it puts a lot of emphasis on the dark arts." "I think I've heard of it," said Ron vaguely. "Where is it? What country?" "Well, nobody knows, do they?" said Hermione, raising her eyebrows. Why not?" said Harry. "There's traditionally been a lot of rivalry between all the magic schools. Durmstrang and Beauxbaton like to conceal their whereabouts so nobody can steal their secrets," said Hermione matter-of-factly. "Come off it," said Ron, starting to laugh. "Durmstrang's got to be about the same size as Hogwarts. How are you going to hide a great big castle?" "But Hogwarts is hidden," said Hermione in surprise. "Everyone knows that. Well, everyone who's read Hogwarts a history anyway." "Just you then," said Ron. "So go on. How do you hide a place like Hogwarts?" "It's bewitched," said Hermione. "If a muggle looks at it, all they see is a moldering old ruin with a sign over the entrance saying, 'Danger, do not enter, unsafe.' So Durmstrang will just look like a ruin to an outsider too?" "Maybe," said Hermione, shrugging. "Or it might have muggle-repelling charms on it, like the World Cup Stadium. And to keep foreign wizards from finding it, they'll have made it unplottable." "Come again?" "Well, you can enchant a building so it's impossible to plot on a map, can't you?" If you say so," said Harry. "But I think Durmstrang must be somewhere in the far north," said Hermione thoughtfully. Somewhere very cold, because they've got fur capes as part of their uniforms. Ah, think of the possibilities, said Ron dreamily. It would have been so easy to push Malfoy off a glacier and make it look like an accident. Shame his mother likes him. The rain became heavier and heavier as the train moved farther north. The sky was so dark and the windows so steamy that the lanterns were lit by midday. The lunch trolley came rattling along the corridor, and Harry bought a large stack of cauldron cakes for them to share. Several of their friends looked in on them as the afternoon progressed, including Seamus Finnegan, Dean Thomas, and Neville Longbottom, a round-faced, extremely forgetful boy who had been brought up by his formidable witch of a grandmother. Seamus was still wearing his Ireland rosette. Some of its magic seemed to be wearing off now. It was still squeaking, "Troy, Mullet, Moran," but in a very feeble and exhausted sort of way. After half an hour or so, Hermione, growing tired of the endless Quidditch talk, buried herself once more in the Standard Book of Spells Grade 4, and started trying to learn a summoning charm. Neville listened jealously to the others' conversation as they relived the cup match. "Grayan didn't want to go," he said miserably. "Wouldn't buy tickets. It sounded amazing, though." "It was," said Ron. "Look at this, Neville." He rummaged in his trunk up in the luggage rack and pulled out the miniature figure of Victor Crumb. "Oh, wow," said Neville enviously as Ron tipped Crumb onto his pudgy hand. "We saw him right up close as well," said Ron. "We were in the top box." "For the first and last time in your life, Weasley." Draco Malfoy had appeared in the doorway. Behind him stood Crabbe and Goyle, his enormous, thuggish cronies, both of whom appeared to have grown at least a foot during the summer. Evidently, they had overheard the conversation through the compartment door, which Dean and Seamus had left ajar. "Don't remember asking you to join us, Malfoy," said Harry coolly. "Weasley." "What is that?" said Malfoy, pointing at Pigwidgeon's cage. A sleeve of Ron's dress robes was dangling from it, swaying with the motion of the train, the moldy lace cuff very obvious. Ron made to stuff the robes out of sight, but Malfoy was too quick for him. He seized the sleeve and pulled. "Look at that," said Malfoy in ecstasy, holding up Ron's robes and showing Crabbe and Goyle. "Weasley, you weren't thinking of wearing these, were you? I mean, they were very fashionable in about 1890. "Eat done, Malfoy," said Ron, the same color as the dress robes, as he snatched them back out of Malfoy's grip. Malfoy howled with derisive laughter. Crabbe and Goyle guffawed stupidly. "So, going to enter, Weasley? Going to try and bring a bit of glory to the family name? There's money involved as well, you know. You'd be able to afford some decent robes if you won." "What are you talking about?" snapped Ron. "Are you going to enter?" Malfoy repeated. "I suppose you will, Potter. You never miss a chance to show off, do you?" "Either explain what you're on about or go away, Malfoy," said Hermione testily, over the top of the Standard Book of Spells Grade 4. A gleeful smile spread across Malfoy's pale face. "Don't tell me you don't know," he said delightedly. "You've got a father and brother at the Ministry and you don't even know? My God, my father told me about it ages ago. Heard it from Cornelius Fudge. But then father's always associated with the top people at the Ministry. Maybe your father's too junior to know about it, Weasley. Yes, they probably don't talk about important stuff in front of him." Laughing once more, Malfoy beckoned to Crabbe and Goyle, and the three of them disappeared. Ron got to his feet and slammed the sliding compartment door so hard behind them that the glass shattered. "Ron," said Hermione reproachfully, and she pulled out her wand, muttered, "Reparo," and the glass shards flew back into a single pane and back into the door. "Well, making it look like he knows everything and we don't," Ron snarled. "Father's always associated with the top people at the ministry. Dad could have got a promotion any time. He just likes it where he is." "Of course he does," said Hermione quietly. "Don't let Malfoy get to you, Ron." "Him? Get to me? As if," said Ron, picking up one of the remaining cauldron cakes and squashing it into a pulp. Ron's bad mood continued for the rest of the journey. He didn't talk much,